every empire in human history has been shaped by its geography. The rivers that fed the civilizations of Earth, the mountains that defended them, the oceans that connected them, the deserts that tested them. The relationship between the land and the people who inhabited it was the relationship that determined what the people became, what they built, what they valued, what they fought for, and what they were willing to die to protect. The Dune universe extended this principle to the interstellar scale. The worlds that the Imperium's civilization occupied were not simply locations, not simply the addresses where the political events occurred. The worlds were the forces that shaped the events, the environments that produced the people, the conditions that determined the institutions, the ecologies that generated the resources around which the political landscape was organized. The planets made the people. The people made the history. The history cannot be understood without the planets that produced it. This is the story of those planets. Not a catalogue, not a planetary survey conducted from the administrative distance of an imperial census. The story of how the worlds shaped the civilizations that inhabited them, how the civilizations' interactions produced the saga's events, and how the events' consequences reshaped the worlds that had produced them. The story of the places that made the Dune universe what it was. Arrakis was the center of everything. Not because Arrakis was the most populous world, it was not. Not because Arrakis was the most politically significant world in the conventional sense. For most of the Imperium's history, the desert planet was a remote, inhospitable, administratively troublesome fief whose governance was assigned to noble houses as a combination of economic opportunity and political liability. Arrakis was the center of everything, because Arrakis was the only source of the substance the civilization could not function without. The spice melange was produced on Arrakis and nowhere else. This fact, simple in its statement, staggering in its implications, was the fact around which the Imperium's political, economic, and navigational systems were organized. The spice was not a luxury. The spice was not a commodity whose absence would have produced inconvenience. The spice was the foundation, the substance that made the Spacing Guild's navigators capable of the prescient perception that interstellar travel required, that extended the lifespans of the Imperium's ruling classes, that enhanced the cognitive functions of the Mentats and the Bene Gesserit. That connected the civilization's hundreds of worlds into the functioning network the Imperium administered. Without the spice, the navigators could not navigate. Without the navigators, the ships could not travel safely through fold space. Without the fold space travel, the interstellar civilization could not exist. The chain of dependency ran from the navigator's consciousness to the spice's biochemistry, to the sandworm life cycle, to the desert conditions that the life cycle required. Every link in the chain terminated at Arrakis. The desert world was not the center of the civilization by design. It was the center of the civilization by dependency. The dependency was total, and the dependency was fragile, and the combination of totality and fragility was the thing that made Arrakis the most consequential piece of real estate in the known universe. The planet itself was hostile. This is the description that every account of Arrakis begins with, and the description was accurate. Arrakis was one of the most demanding environments the Imperium's worlds included, a planet whose conditions killed the unprepared with the efficiency that the desert's ecology demanded. The surface was sand. Not exclusively. There were rock formations, there were mountain ranges, there were the shield wall's geological features that separated the settled areas from the deep desert. But the sand was dominant, was the landscape's primary character, the medium through which the ecology operated, and through which the human populations navigated their existence. The heat was extreme. The desert's surface temperatures during the day exceeded what unprotected human physiology could tolerate for extended periods. The nights were cold. The desert's thermal dynamics produced temperature swings that the clothing and the shelter technology had to accommodate. The temperature extremes were part of the ecological system, were features of the environment that the sandworm life cycle and the human survival both had to be organized around. The water was absent. This was the condition that defined Arrakis more than any other, the near-total absence of surface water, the aridity that made water the most valuable resource on the planet's surface, and that organized every dimension of the human habitation around the water's management. The stillsuits that the desert populations wore, the full-body garments that reclaimed the body's moisture through the filtration and the recycling of the wearer's perspiration, breath, and other fluid losses, were the most visible expression of the water's absence. The stillsuit was not optional. The stillsuit was survival. The sandworms were the ecology's dominant organism. The creatures, enormous, segmented, dwelling in the deep sand, capable of lengths that exceeded 400 meters, were the desert's most visible inhabitants and the ecology's most consequential participants. The sandworms were not simply large animals. They were the ecology's keystone, the organism whose life cycle produced the conditions that the rest of the ecology depended on. The sandworm life cycle was a closed system. The life cycle began with the sand trout, the larval form whose biological function was the encapsulation of water. The sand trout sequestered water beneath the sand's surface, maintaining the arid conditions the adult sandworms required. The sequestration was the life cycle's ecological foundation, the mechanism that kept the desert a desert. That prevented the accumulation of surface water that would have transformed the environment into something the adult worms could not survive in. The adult sandworms could not tolerate water. The creatures were vulnerable to moisture. Water was lethal to them, and the presence of water on the desert surface was the condition the sand trout's encapsulation was designed to prevent. The sandworm's water vulnerability was the life cycle's most consequential feature, because the vulnerability meant that the ecology's maintenance depended on the sand trout's continued water sequestration, and any disruption of the sequestration, any introduction of moisture that the sand trout could not contain, would threaten the adult worms and the spice production the adult worm's life cycle. Generated. The spice was the life cycle's byproduct. The melange was produced through the biological processes the sandworm life cycle operated, was generated by the interaction between the sand trout's water encapsulation and the biochemical reactions the encapsulation produced. The spice accumulated in the sand was deposited by the life cycle's ongoing operations in concentrations that the harvesting equipment could detect and extract. The production was continuous, was natural, was the organic output of an ecological system that had been operating on Arrakis for millennia. The spice was also psychoactive. The melange's biochemical properties included the enhancement of cognitive function, the extension of lifespan, and the activation of latent prescient capabilities in sufficiently sensitive individuals. The properties were what made the spice valuable, what made the substance the foundation of the civilization's navigational, cognitive, and longevity systems. The properties were also what made the spice addictive. The sustained consumption produced a physiological dependency whose withdrawal was fatal, creating the condition that the spice's consumers could never escape. The ecology was the economy. The spice production was not a mining operation in the conventional sense, was not the extraction of a mineral resource from geological deposits. The spice production was the harvesting of a biological output, the collection of the melange that the sandworm life cycle deposited on the desert's surface. The harvesting was conducted by the industrial operations the governing house maintained, the crawler equipment that collected the spice from the sand, the carrier aircraft that retrieved the crawlers when the sandworm's approach made the collection sites dangerous, the processing facilities that refined the collected melange for distribution through the CHOAM framework. The harvesting was dangerous. The sandworms were attracted to the rhythmic vibrations the harvesting equipment produced. The crawler's operation created the thumping patterns that drew the worms toward the collection sites. The harvesting required the constant monitoring of the sand for the worms' approach signals, the rapid deployment of the carriers to retrieve the crawlers before the worms arrived, the management of the timing that allowed the maximum collection before the evacuation the worms' approach required. The danger was the cost. The spice production consumed equipment and occasionally consumed workers. The harvesting operations casualties were part of the production's operational budget. The price the spices collection exacted from the people and the machinery the collection required. The cost was accepted because the revenue exceeded the cost by margins that made the acceptance economically rational. The spice's value was so great that the production's costs, however significant, were minor fractions of the revenue the production generated. The human populations that inhabited Arrakis were shaped by the planet's conditions with the thoroughness that demanding environments always imposed on the people who lived in them. The settled populations, the people who lived in the cities and the towns that the shield wall's protection permitted, were the populations the Imperium's administrative framework recognized. These populations were not desert people, were not adapted to the deep desert's conditions, were not formed by the desert's demands. The settled populations were colonial, were the Imperium's presence on Arrakis, maintained by the governance's infrastructure and the commerce's economic activity, living in conditions that the technology and the administration made tolerable, rather than in conditions the environment itself provided. The Fremen were the other population. The desert people whose existence the administrative framework consistently underestimated and whose capability the intelligence apparatus consistently failed to assess. The Fremen inhabited the deep desert, not the settled areas the shield wall protected, the open desert, the sand seas, the regions where the sandworms moved and where the conditions killed the unprepared, and where the Fremen's millennia of adaptation had produced the survival capability the conditions required. The Fremen's adaptation was comprehensive. Every dimension of the Fremen's existence was organized around the desert's demands, the water discipline that managed the body's moisture with a precision that exceeded what any other culture had achieved, the stillsuit technology that reclaimed the body's fluids with an efficiency that approached total recovery, the sietch communities that provided the shelter and the social organization the desert existence required. The water discipline was the Fremen's defining cultural practice. The discipline was not simply a set of procedures for water management, it was a cultural ethic, a value system, a way of understanding the relationship between the person and the environment that organized every dimension of the Fremen social life. Water was sacred. Water was shared. Water was the medium of the community's most important rituals. The greeting, the mourning, the ceremonial occasions that the culture's traditions specified. The Fremen's military capability was the desert's product. The environmental hardening, the physical demands the desert imposed, the survival skills the desert required, the combat traditions the desert's conditions had refined across millennia, produced warriors whose individual capability exceeded what the Imperium's most demanding military traditions could produce. The Fremen were better fighters than the Sardaukar, better because the desert's conditions were more demanding than Seleucus Secundus's conditions, because the Fremen's environmental selection was more thorough than the Sardakar's institutional selection, because the desert had been hardening the Fremen for longer and more completely than the prison planet had been hardening the Emperor's soldiers. The capability was invisible. The Imperium's intelligence apparatus, the Harkonnen governance's administrative assessment, the imperial census, the Chome production reports, did not see the Fremen's military capability because the apparatus was not designed to see it. The apparatus assessed populations through the lens of the administrative framework, counted heads for the census, estimated production for the economic reports, assessed security threats for the governance's operational planning. The apparatus did not assess civilizations, did not evaluate the cultural depth, the organizational sophistication, the military training that the Fremen's desert existence had produced. The invisibility was the Fremen's protection and the Imperium's vulnerability. The protection kept the Fremen's civilization intact across the decades of Harkonnen governance, kept the deep desert communities hidden from the governance's attention, the military capability concealed from the intelligence assessment, the true population numbers obscured by the Spacing Guild's cooperation with the Fremen's bribery arrangement. The vulnerability was exposed at the battle for Arrakis, the moment at which the invisible capability was deployed and the intelligence failure's consequences were demonstrated with devastating clarity. Arrakis made the Fremen. The desert's conditions produced the people. The people's capabilities produced the military force. The military force produced the revolution. The revolution produced the jihad. The planet was not a backdrop. The planet was a cause. Caladan was Arrakis's opposite in every environmental dimension, and the opposition was what made Caladan's contribution to the saga's events what it was. The world that produced the people whose encounter with Arrakis transformed both the people and the planet. Caladan was a water world. The description was literal. The planet's surface was dominated by oceans. The climate was temperate, the rainfall was abundant, the vegetation was lush. The conditions were the conditions that human biology was evolved for. The temperature range, the atmospheric composition, the water availability that the human body's physiology required for comfortable functioning. Caladan was habitable in the deepest sense, was a world where the human organism could exist without the technological mediation that harsher environments demanded. The Atreides had governed Caladan for generations. The governance had produced the institutional culture the house was known for, the commitment to service, the integrity of the leadership, the loyalty of the retainers, the quality of governance that the Landsraad admired and that the Corrino dynasty feared. The world shaped the culture. Caladan's abundance, the water, the food, the habitable conditions that the planet provided, produced a governance tradition that was organized around the management of abundance rather than around the management of scarcity. The Atreides did not govern through the control of resources, did not use the threat of denial as the governance's primary tool, did not maintain the population's compliance through the manipulation of the supply that the population depended on. The Atreides governed through the provision of conditions, through the management of the public life in ways that served the population's interests rather than only the governor's interests. The governance as service ethic was Caladan's product. The world's conditions made the ethic possible. The abundance provided the material conditions that the service required. The climate's mildness reduced the governance's survival demands. The environment's hospitality allowed the governance to focus on the quality of the governed's life rather than on the managed distribution of insufficient resources. A world of scarcity would have produced a different governance ethic. Caladan's abundance produced the Atreides ethic, and the ethic was one of the most admired traditions in the Landsraad's political landscape. The household that Caladan produced reflected the world's character. The Retainer Corps, Tufir Hawat, Gurney Halleck, Duncan Idaho, served the Atreides with a loyalty that was earned rather than compelled. The loyalty was earned because the service was reciprocal. The Duke served the retainers, as the retainers served the Duke. The relationship was one of mutual respect rather than unilateral authority. The household's culture treated its members as persons rather than as instruments. The culture's transplantation to Arrakis was the event that initiated the saga's central narrative. The Atreides household, formed by Caladan's conditions, carrying Caladan's values, organized around Caladan's ethic, was placed on a world that was the opposite of everything Caladan had provided. The Waterworld's people were put on the desert world. The abundance ethic was confronted with scarcity. The service tradition was tested against conditions that the tradition's formation had not anticipated. The test was lethal. The Harkonnen assault destroyed the household's institutional form. The test's survival was the survival of the values carried by Jessica and Paul into the desert. The values that shaped the people Paul led and the governance Paul eventually provided. Caladan's values survived Caladan's destruction. The world's contribution to the saga was the contribution of the values the world had produced, carried forward by the people who carried the world's formation inside them. Giedi Prime was Caladan's antithesis. The world whose conditions produced the Harkonnen tradition, the way Caladan's conditions produced the Atreides tradition, the planetary evidence that environments make institutions and institutions make history. Giedi Prime was industrial. The planet's economy was organized around manufacturing and extraction, the production of goods and the harvesting of resources at scales that made the planet one of the Imperium's most productive economic units. The production was not clean. The planet's environment bore the marks of the exploitation the economy imposed, polluted, degraded, bearing the visible consequences of an industrial operation that prioritized output over sustainability. The degradation was the Harkonnen governance philosophy made physical. The Baron's approach to governance, the treatment of resources as things to be consumed rather than systems to be maintained, was visible in Giedi Prime's environmental condition. The planet showed what the governance did. The air showed what the governance valued. The landscape showed what the governance was willing to sacrifice for the productivity the governance measured its success by. The population's conditions reflected the environment's conditions. The people of Giedi Prime were governed as a labor force rather than as a citizenry. The distinction mattered because the management of a labor force was organized around the extraction of productivity, while the management of a citizenry was organized around the provision of conditions under which the citizens could thrive. The Harkonnen governance provided conditions under which the population could produce. The conditions under which the population might thrive were not part of the calculation. The gladiatorial arenas were the population's entertainment. The arenas provided the cathartic violence that the Harkonnen governance used as a substitute for the political participation other governance traditions provided. The population could not participate in governance. The population could watch people fight to the death. The watching was designed to provide the emotional release that the absence of political participation would otherwise have produced as unrest. The arenas were also the political stage. Fade Rotha Harkonnen, the Baron's heir, the young man being groomed as the Harkonnen future, fought in the arenas as a demonstration of his capability and as a performance for the population's assessment. The fights were managed, The opponents were selected and sometimes compromised to ensure the outcomes the political narrative required. The management was characteristic. The Harkonnen tradition's preference for the appearance of capability over the reality, for the managed performance over the uncontrolled test. Giedi Prime produced the Harkonnens the way Caladan produced the Atreides. The industrial world produced the exploitative governance. The polluted environment produced the instrumentalist ethic. The managed population produced the managed arenas. The managed arenas produced the managed air. The chain of production ran from the world, through the institution, through the culture, through the persons, each link shaped by the conditions the previous link provided. The Baron himself was Giedi Prime's most visible product, the mind whose capabilities were formed in the industrial world's competitive environment, whose governance philosophy reflected the planet's instrumental approach to resources, whose political operation was as efficient and as exploitative as the planet's industrial economy. The Baron's body was not Giedi Prime's product. The body was the Bene Gesserit's weapon, the disease Mothium had given him. But the Baron's mind was Giedi Prime's, and the mind was the thing that made the Baron what he was. The contrast between Caladan and Giedi Prime was the saga's most direct demonstration of the relationship between environment and institutional character. The two worlds were approximately equal in economic capability. Both were productive. Both supported economies whose outputs made the governing houses wealthy enough to maintain the political positions the Landsraad's landscape required. The equality of capability made the inequality of character more visible, demonstrated that the difference between the Atreides and the Harkonnens was not a difference of resources, but a difference of values, and that the values were the products of the worlds the houses governed, rather than simply the products of the houses' internal cultures. Caladan said, "The world provides, and the governance's purpose is the management of the provision. The governance serves the provided. The governance is justified by the quality of the served population's experience." Giedi Prime said, "The world is raw material, and the governance's purpose is the extraction of productivity. The governance exploits the material. The governance is justified by the quantity of the output the exploitation generates." The two statements were the two governance philosophies the Imperium's political landscape contained, expressed in their purest forms by the two houses whose worlds had produced them in their clearest versions. Other houses occupied positions between the extremes, governed with varying combinations of the service ethic and the exploitation ethic, shaped by the worlds that produced them and by the institutional traditions the world's conditions had generated. The Corrino dynasty had managed the contrast for centuries, had maintained the rivalry between the two houses at the calibrated intensity that served the dynasty's political purposes, had used the contrast as a tool for the management of the Landsraad's political dynamics. The management ended when Shaddam concluded that the Atreides' position threatened the dynasty and initiated the conspiracy that placed the Caladan household on the desert world. The transfer was the collision. The Caladan values met the Arrakis conditions. The collision produced the transformation. The transformation of Paul from the Caladan heir into the desert Messiah. The transformation of the Fremen from the invisible civilization into the conquering army. The transformation of the Imperium from the Corrino governance into the Atreides governance. The collision was a planetary event, was produced by the encounter between what one world had created and what another world contained. The people Caladan had shaped encountered the world Arrakis was, and the encounter produced the change that reshaped everything. The relationship between Giedi Prime and Arrakis was different from the relationship between Caladan and Arrakis, And the difference illuminated the different ways the Harkonnen and Atreides traditions interacted with the desert world. The Harkonnens had governed Arrakis for 80 years before the Atreides transfer. The governance had been conducted in the Giedi Prime tradition, the exploitation of the resource, the treatment of the planet as raw material, the management of the population as a labour force. The governance had produced the spice revenue the CHOAM framework required. The governance had not produced the understanding of the planet the governance was exploiting. The Harkonnens did not understand Arrakis. The industrial world's people treated the desert world the way the industrial world treated every resource as something to be harvested. The harvesting was efficient. The harvesting was also ignorant, was conducted without the ecological understanding that the harvesting's long-term consequences required, without the awareness of the sandworm life cycle's vulnerability, without the recognition that the planet's most valuable resource was the product of an ecology whose maintenance the harvesting was not designed to support. The ignorance was characteristic. Giedi Prime's governance tradition did not include ecological awareness, did not include the understanding of environmental systems that the exploitation's sustainability required, did not include the assessment of the extraction's long-term consequences that a more ecologically informed tradition would have produced. The Harkonnen governance extracted. The Harkonnen governance did not understand what it was extracting from. The Atreides' encounter with Arrakis was different. The Caladan tradition, shaped by the water world's ecological richness, informed by the governance as service ethic that the abundant environment had produced, approached Arrakis with a different orientation. The Atreides were interested in the planet, in the ecology, in the conditions, in the systems that produced the planet's conditions. The interest was not purely scientific. The interest was the governance tradition's expression on a new world, the Atreides' ethics response to a new set of conditions. Leto's governance of Arrakis, brief as it was, terminated by the Harkonnen assault before the governance's full program could be developed, was the governance that the Atreides tradition would have produced on the desert world. The governance would have included the ecological awareness that the Harkonnen tradition had lacked. The governance would have included the engagement with the Fremen that the Harkonnen tradition had refused. The governance would have produced a different relationship between the governing house and the governed planet. The governance was destroyed before it could develop. The destruction was the conspiracy's objective, the elimination of the Atreides household before the Atreides governance could demonstrate the alternative that the Corrino dynasty feared the Landsraad would prefer. The elimination succeeded in destroying the governance. The elimination did not destroy the values. The values survived in Paul. The values encountered the desert. The encounter produced the revolution. Salusa Secundus was the planet that made the Imperium possible, and that the Imperium tried to hide. The planet's official designation was the Imperial Prison World, the penal colony where the Imperium's most dangerous criminals were sent to serve sentences whose conditions the criminal justice system's severity demanded. The designation was accurate. Salusa Secundus was a prison. The conditions were harsh, the environment's demands exceeded what most human constitutions could tolerate. The survival rate among the prisoners was low. The conditions that the survivors endured were the conditions that hardened the survivors into something the conditions' designers had intended. The unofficial function was the function that made the planet consequential. Salusa Secundus was the Sardakar's training ground. The harsh conditions that served as punishment for criminals simultaneously served as the selection process for soldiers. The prisoners who survived the planet's conditions, who endured the environment's hostility and the social environment's brutality, and emerged from the experience capable of functioning under conditions that would have broken less resilient individuals, were the recruitment pool from which the Sardaukar were drawn. The system was elegant in its exploitation. The same planet served two functions, punishment and selection, through the same conditions. The conditions that punished the criminals hardened the soldiers. The prison's harshness was the military's filter. The institution's dual purpose made the institution more efficient than either purpose alone would have required. The prison's population provided the military's candidates, and the military's needs justified the prison's conditions. The secrecy was the system's political requirement. The relationship between the prison conditions and the military capability was not publicly acknowledged, was maintained with the deniability that the political framework required. The Landsraad's political actors knew, or suspected, that the Sardaukar's capability was produced by conditions that the Imperium administered. The knowledge was not publicly articulated. The public acknowledgement would have created the political problem that the deniability prevented. The planet's history included a dimension that the official records documented, but that the political narrative tended to minimize. Seleucia Secundus had been the Corrino homeworld. Before the dynasty's seat was transferred to Kaitain, Seleucia Secundus had been the world from which the Corrinos governed. The planet whose conditions the early Corrino emperors had inhabited, whose environment the dynasty's founding generations had experienced. The transfer of the seat to Kaitain, the move of the imperial capital to a world whose conditions were more comfortable and whose political presentation was more suitable, was the administrative decision that converted the former homeworld into the prison planet the Sardaukar's production required. The conversion was the dynasty's most consequential institutional decision. The decision to maintain the homeworld's harsh conditions rather than ameliorating them, to use the conditions for the military's production rather than transforming them into the comfortable environment the capital's relocation had sought, was the decision that produced the Sardaukar. The Sardaukar were the dynasty's most important institutional asset. The asset was produced by the conditions the dynasty chose to maintain on the world the dynasty had abandoned. The irony of Seleucia Secundus's relationship with the Corrino dynasty deepened after the dynasty's fall. Shaddam IV, the last Corrino emperor, was exiled to Seleucia Secundus after Paul's revolution. The former emperor was sent to the world that had been the dynasty's homeworld, that had been converted into the prison planet whose conditions produced the military force that had maintained the dynasty for 10,000 years. The exile was poetic. The dynasty's last ruler was placed in the conditions the dynasty had maintained for the military's benefit, experiencing as a resident the environment the dynasty had administered as a tool. The exile was also the Corrino house's continued connection to the planet that had produced the dynasty's most important asset. The Sardaukar remnant, the diminished military force that the Corrino house maintained after the dynasty's fall, continued to train on Seleucia Secundus, continued to draw on the environmental conditions the planet provided, continued to produce soldiers whose hardening reflected the planet's conditions, even as the soldiers' relevance to the political landscape diminished. Seleucia Secundus was the planet that demonstrated more directly than any other world in the saga the relationship between environmental harshness and human capability. The planet's conditions were the conditions that made the Sardaukar what they were, the most capable conventional military force in the Imperium for 10,000 years. The capability was the environment's product. The product was the dynasty's tool. The tool maintained the dynasty. The chain of production ran from the planet, through the soldiers, through the governments, through the 10,000-year reign. The chain's weakness was the chain's environmental link. The conditions on Seleucia Secundus that produced the Sardaukars' capability were harsh, but they were not as harsh as Arrakis' conditions. The desert world's environmental demands exceeded the prison planet's environmental demands, and the Fremen's capabilities, produced by the desert's more comprehensive hardening, exceeded the Sardaukars' capabilities by the margin that the environmental difference produced. The Sardaukars' defeat at Arrakis was the demonstration that the environmental chain could be broken by a more demanding environment. The planet that had produced the dynasty's military force was a less demanding planet than the planet that had produced the force that defeated it. The chain of production that ran from Seleucia Secundus through the Sardaukar through the dynasty was broken by the chain of production that ran from Arrakis through the Fremen through the revolution. The planets fought each other through the people they produced. Seleucia Secundus versus Arrakis. The Sardaukar versus the Fremen, the prison planet versus the desert world. The Fremen won because the desert was more demanding than the prison. The victory was the planet's verdict on each other, the determination that the desert's hardening exceeded the prison's hardening, settled on the battlefield at Arrakis. Kaitain was the planet the Imperium wanted to be seen as, the capital world whose conditions and whose presentation communicated the civilization's self-image. Kaitain was the imperial seat, the world from which the Corrino dynasty governed the known universe, the political center that the Imperium's administrative functions were organized around, the location of the imperial court whose social and political dynamics constituted the Imperium's most consequential ongoing negotiation. The planet was beautiful. This was the characteristic that the political presentation emphasized: the well-maintained environment, the carefully managed ecology, the aesthetic standards that the imperial administration enforced in the capital's physical presentation. Kaitain was a showcase, was the world the Imperium put forward as the visible expression of what the civilization valued and what the civilization was capable of. The beauty was maintained rather than natural. Kaitain's environment was managed, was the product of the sustained investment in environmental maintenance that the capital's political function required. The management consumed resources. The economic investment in the planet's appearance exceeded what the planet's productive economy would have justified on economic grounds alone. The investment was political rather than economic, was justified by the political function the capital's appearance served, rather than by the economic returns the investment generated. The court was Kaitain's most consequential institutional feature. The imperial court, the social and political institution that surrounded the emperor, that served as the forum for the Imperium's most consequential political interactions, that provided the social setting in which the Landsraat's houses conducted their ongoing negotiations, was the court that every political actor in the Imperium oriented toward. The court's dynamics were the dynamics of power performed as social ritual. The precedents, the protocols, the ceremonies, and the entertainments that the court's calendar included all were the mechanisms through which the political hierarchy was expressed and the political relationships were maintained. The court was not decorative. The court was functional, the mechanism through which the political landscape's most consequential dynamics were managed in the social form that the Imperium's political culture required. Kaitain's relationship with the other worlds was the relationship of a center to its periphery. The capital drew the Imperium's political attention toward itself, concentrated the political activity in the location the capital occupied, organized the political landscape around the capital's position. The concentration was the capital's function, was the thing the capital existed to produce, the political gravity that pulled the Imperium's political actors toward the location where the governance's decisions were made and where the governance's authority was displayed. The concentration had costs. The capital's political gravity distorted the political landscape, made the capital's concerns the Imperium's concerns, made the capital's perspective the Imperium's perspective, made the distance from the capital the measure of the political landscape's attention. The worlds that were distant from Kaitain, the peripheral worlds whose conditions and whose concerns the capital's political gravity did not pull toward the centre, were the worlds the governance's attention served least effectively. Arrakis was distant from Kaitain. The desert world, the Imperium's most economically important planet, the source of the substance the civilization could not function without, was far from the capital's political gravity, was governed through the fief assignment mechanism rather than through the direct attention the capital's proximity would have provided. The distance contributed to the governance's failure on Arrakis, the failure to assess the Fremen's capability, the failure to manage the ecology's vulnerability, the failure to understand what the planet the governance was administering actually was. The capital was the centre that could not see the periphery. The periphery was where the revolution started. The capital's inability to see the revolution's approach was the capital's most consequential failure. The failure that the capital's political gravity, by concentrating the political attention on the centre, had produced. Wallach 9 was the planet the Bene Gesserit called home, and the planet's character illuminated the Sisterhood's institutional identity in its most direct form. The Bene Gesserit's primary training facility was located on Wallach 9, the school where the Sisterhood's acolytes received the training that transformed them from untrained initiates into the Bene Gesserit practitioners whose capabilities the Imperium respected and feared. The training facility was the Sisterhood's most important institutional asset, the physical location where the tradition was transmitted, where the capabilities were developed, where the institutional culture was instilled in the next generation of practitioners. The planet's environment was controlled. Wallach 9 was not the harsh environment that Seleucus Secundus was not the demanding landscape that the Sardaukars' environmental selection required. The planet was managed, its conditions maintained at the levels the training facility's operations required, its environment calibrated to the training's demands rather than to the environmental extremes that hardening through survival produced. The management reflected the Bene Gesserit's institutional philosophy. The Sisterhood did not produce its practitioners through environmental selection, did not filter the candidates through the mechanism of survival in harsh conditions the way the Sardaukars' training did. The Sisterhood produced its practitioners through training, through the sustained, systematic, institutionally managed development of capabilities that the training's design specified. The training was demanding. The training was also controlled, was conducted within the conditions the institutional management determined were optimal for the capabilities' development. The difference between the Sardaukars' production and the Bene Gesserit's production was the difference between environmental selection and institutional cultivation, and the difference was expressed in the planets that produced them. Seleucus Secundus was the planet that filtered, that used the environmental conditions as a selection mechanism, that eliminated the incapable and identified the capable through the crude but effective mechanism of survival. Wallach 9 was the planet that cultivated, that used the institutional conditions as a development mechanism, that transformed the capable into the trained through the sophisticated but controlled mechanism of education. The two methods produced different products. The Sardaukar were hard, were forged by conditions that made softness lethal, were defined by the resilience the conditions had demanded. The Bene Gesserit were refined, were developed by training that made crudeness ineffective, were defined by the precision the training had cultivated. The hardness was Seleucus Secundus's gift. The refinement was Wallach Nine's gift. Both gifts served the institutions that received them. Both gifts were limited by the conditions that produced them. Wallach Nine's was also the repository of the Sisterhood's institutional knowledge. The archives, the genetic records, the breeding programs accumulated data, the informational infrastructure that the Sisterhood's millennia of operation had produced was maintained on the planet the training facility occupied. The knowledge's physical location was the Sisterhood's most vulnerable point. The destruction of Wallach 9 would have destroyed the accumulated knowledge the Sisterhood's institutional operations depended on. The vulnerability was eventually exploited. The Honored Mattress's destruction of Bene Gesserit installations, the aggressive expansion that the returning faction conducted across the old Imperium's landscape included the targeting of the Sisterhood's institutional infrastructure. The destruction of the Bene Gesserit's facilities forced the Sisterhood's relocation to Chapter House, the planet that would become the Sisterhood's final documented base of operations. Chapter House was the planet that the Bene Gesserit transformed into the institutional base the Honored Mattress's destruction of their previous facilities required. The transformation was comprehensive. The Sisterhood converted Chapter House into the institutional infrastructure the crisis demanded, relocated the training operations, transferred the institutional knowledge, established the governance and the administrative functions that the Sisterhood's continued operation required. The transformation was conducted under the pressure of the Honored Mattress's ongoing threat. Was the crisis response of an institution whose survival required the rapid establishment of a new institutional base. Chapter House's most consequential transformation was ecological. The Sisterhood introduced sandworms to the planet, transplanted the sandworm ecology from Arrakis, establishing the biological system whose operation would eventually produce the spice the Sisterhood's operations required. The introduction was a gamble. The sandworm ecology's establishment on a non-desert world required the environmental modification that the ecology's conditions demanded, and the modification would progressively transform Chapter House's environment from whatever its original conditions had been toward the desert conditions the sandworms required. The transformation was the Sisterhood's most direct engagement with the ecological argument the saga sustained. The Bene Gesserit, by introducing the sandworm ecology to Chapter House, were accepting the trade of the ecology imposed, accepting the planet's transformation into a desert environment in exchange for the spice production the ecology would eventually generate. The trade-off was the mirror of the Fremen's terraforming dream, where the Fremen were transforming a desert into a green world at the cost of the spice production. The Bene Gesserit were transforming a green world into a desert for the benefit of the spice production. The mirror demonstrated the saga's ecological argument in its most direct form. The human relationship with the environment was always a trade-off. The Fremen traded spice for green. The Bene Gesserit traded green for spice. Neither trade was free. Neither trade was reversible. The environment's transformation was the price of the transformation's product. And the price was paid by the planet the transformation was conducted on. Chapter House was the planet where the merger occurred, where Mabella's combination of the Bene Gesserit and Honored Matra traditions produced the merged institution that the saga's final documented events described. The planet's role as the institutional base for the merger was the planet's most consequential contribution to the saga's narrative. The provision of the location and the institutional infrastructure within which the two traditions were combined. Ix was the planet that pushed against the Butlerian prohibition's boundaries, and the planet's institutional character illuminated the tension between the prohibition's theological requirements and the civilization's technological needs. The Ixian tradition was engineering. The planet's culture was organized around the development and the production of technologies that served the Imperium's commercial and institutional demands, the machines, the devices. The engineering solutions that the post-Jihad civilization's prohibition against thinking machines left space for. The Ixians developed technologies that approached the prohibition's boundary without crossing it, technologies that performed cognitive functions through mechanisms the Ixian engineering tradition argued were not in the likeness of human minds, and that the prohibition's stricter interpreters argued were. The boundary was political as much as theological. The prohibition's language was interpretable. The likeness of a human mind was not a precisely defined concept, and the determination of whether a given technology crossed the boundary was a determination that the Imperium's political and theological institutions had to make on a case-by-case basis. The Ixians' institutional interest was in the boundary's loosest interpretation, in the reading of the prohibition that left the maximum space for the technological development the Ixian economy depended on. The prohibition's defenders' institutional interest was in the boundary's strictest interpretation, in the reading that minimized the risk of the thinking machine's recreation. The tension between the Ixians and the prohibition's defenders was one of the Imperium's defining institutional dynamics, a sustained negotiation about the civilization's relationship with its own technological capability, conducted across centuries of the negotiation's institutional history. The negotiation was never resolved, was never settled in either the Ixians' favor or the prohibition's defenders' favor, was maintained as an ongoing dynamic whose management the Imperium's political framework included as one of its regular functions. The Ixian economy was the Imperium's primary source of advanced technology. The machines the Ixians produced, the manufacturing equipment, the communication devices, the navigational instruments, the engineering solutions the civilization's complexity required, were the products the Imperium's commerce distributed and the Imperium's institutions depended on. The dependency made the Ixians politically significant, made the planet's economic output a political asset whose disruption would have affected every institution that depended on the output's continued availability. The Ixians operated underground. The planet's manufacturing facilities were subterranean, were located beneath the surface in the excavated spaces the Ixian engineering tradition had developed for the production's requirements. The underground location was practical. The manufacturing's requirements were better served by the controlled conditions the subterranean facilities provided than by the surface conditions the planet's environment offered. The underground location was also concealing, kept the manufacturing's most consequential operations out of the observation that surface facilities would have been subject to. Maintained the secrecy the Ixians' boundary-pushing technology development required. The concealment was characteristic of the Ixian institutional culture. The planet's most important activities were conducted out of sight, were hidden from the observation of the Imperium's political and theological institutions, maintained behind the barriers of the secrecy the Ixian tradition had developed for the protection of the technology development the prohibition's boundary made politically sensitive. The Ixians' most consequential technology was the navigation machine, the mechanical device designed to replicate the Guild Navigator's prescient perception through technological rather than biological means. The navigation machine's development was a long-term project whose completion would have threatened the Guild's navigational monopoly by providing an alternative to the spice-dependent biological navigation the Guild's navigators provided. The navigation machine was the Ixian tradition's most direct challenge to the Imperium's institutional architecture. The machine threatened the Guild's monopoly. The machine threatened the spice's centrality. The the machine threatened the ecological dependency that the civilization's navigational system imposed. The machine was, in its potential, the technology that could have broken the chain of dependency that ran from the navigators through the spice, through the sandworms, through the desert. The technology that could have freed the civilization from the single substance on which everything depended. The development's completion was uncertain across the saga's documented timeline. The navigation machine's availability was referenced in the later novels as a technology in development rather than as a technology in deployment, a potential rather than a reality. A future capability rather than a present one. The uncertainty was part of the saga's ecological argument, the demonstration that the civilization's dependency on the spice was not easily broken, that the technological alternative's development was difficult enough that the dependency might persist long after the dependency's risks had been identified. Ix was the planet that asked whether human civilization could think its way out of the dependencies the civilization's structure had produced. The answer, across the saga's documented timeline, was not yet, not quickly enough, not comprehensively enough. The dependency persisted. The technology developed. The development was not fast enough to break the dependency before the dependency's consequences materialized. Tlilax, the world of the Bene Tlilax, was the planet that embodied the biological approach to the problems the Ixians addressed through engineering, and the planet's institutional character illuminated the relationship between biological capability and moral consideration that the saga's argument sustained. The Tlilax were genetic manipulators. The planet's institutional tradition was organized around the development and the deployment of biological capabilities, the genetic engineering, the cloning, the biological production that the Tlilaxu culture had refined across centuries of sustained institutional investment. The Tlilax produced golas. The Tlilax produced face dancers. The Tlilax produced the biological solutions the Imperium's institutional demands required. The Tlilax operated in secrecy. The planet's institutional culture was organized around the concealment of the methods the biological production employed, the maintenance of the institutional secrecy that kept the production's mechanisms hidden from the Imperium's observation. The secrecy was comprehensive, was maintained across centuries of the institution's operation, was defended against the intelligence operations of the Imperium's other institutions, was the Tlilax's most consistently maintained institutional practice. The secrecy concealed the axolotl tanks, the biological production facilities that the Tlilax's most consequential capabilities required. The systems in which the golas were grown, the face dancers were produced, the genetic engineering's products were manufactured, were not facilities in the mechanical sense, they were women. The axolotl tanks were Tlilaxu women, women whose bodies were used as the biological factories in which the Tlilax's products were manufactured, whose autonomy was eliminated, whose consciousness was reduced to the level the production function required. The revelation of the axolotl tank's nature was one of the saga's most disturbing moments. The exposure of the biological exploitation that the Tlilax's institutional secrecy had concealed across centuries of the exploitation's operation. The exploitation was comprehensive, was the use of women's bodies as manufacturing equipment, the treatment of persons as biological infrastructure, the elimination of autonomy in service of the production's institutional purposes. The planet's character reflected the exploitation. Tlilax was a closed world, a planet whose institutional culture maintained the secrecy the exploitation required, whose social structure was organized around the gender hierarchy the exploitation depended on, whose religious traditions provided the theological justification the exploitation's moral dimension demanded. The Tleilax's religious culture, the tradition that the Tleilaxu maintained alongside the biological production the culture concealed, provided the framework within which the exploitation was justified as a religious practice rather than recognized as a moral violation. The relationship between Ix and Tleilax was the relationship between two approaches to the same problem, the problem of how to develop capabilities the Prohibition's post-jihad framework left space for. Ix addressed the problem through engineering, through the mechanical technologies that the Prohibition's boundary permitted. Tleilax addressed the problem through biology, through the biological capabilities that the biological system's exploitation made available. The two approaches reflected the two planets' institutional characters. Ix was mechanical, was organized around the development of machines, the engineering of solutions, the technological approach to the civilization's challenges. Tleilax was biological, was organized around the development of biological capabilities, the genetic engineering of solutions, the organic approach to the civilization's challenges. The two approaches also reflected the two planets' moral dimensions. Ix's approach was morally neutral in its method. The engineering of machines did not inherently require the exploitation of persons. The machines were things. The things could be made without the moral cost that the exploitation of persons imposed. Tleilax's approach was morally compromised in its method. The biological production required the exploitation of women's bodies, the elimination of persons' autonomy, the treatment of conscious beings as manufacturing equipment. The moral distinction was the saga's argument about the relationship between method and morality, the demonstration that the choice of how to develop capabilities was a moral choice as well as a technical one, that the method's moral dimension was as consequential as the method's technical effectiveness, that the civilization's institutional practices carried moral weight regardless of the practice's technical productivity. Ix and Tleilax were the two planets that addressed the Prohibition's technological gap through different means, and the means' moral dimensions were the dimensions that the planet's institutional characters illuminated most directly. The Tleilaxu face dancers were the planet's most politically consequential product across the saga's later timeline, and the face dancers' capabilities illuminated the relationship between the planet and the political landscape the planet's products were deployed in. Face dancers were shapeshifters, biological constructs capable of assuming the physical appearance of other persons, of replicating the external presentation with a fidelity that made the detection of the substitution difficult. The capability was the Tleilax's most valuable intelligence tool, the mechanism through which the Tleilaxu institutional interests were advanced in the political landscape's ongoing negotiations. The face dancers' capabilities evolved across the saga's timeline. The early face dancers were limited, were detectable by the Bene Gesserit's trained perception, were imperfect in their replication of the persons they were imitating, were tools whose utility was constrained by the tool's limitations. The later face dancers, the versions that appeared in the saga's final novels, were more capable, harder to detect, more comprehensive in their replication, more autonomous in their operation. The evolution reflected the Tleilax's sustained institutional investment in the face dancer's development, the ongoing refinement of the biological technology that produced the face dancers, the progressive improvement of the capabilities the technology's application generated. The evolution was also threatening, was the progression toward a capability whose comprehensiveness made the detection increasingly difficult and the infiltration increasingly effective. The face dancers' deployment across the saga's political landscape was the Tleilax's primary mechanism of political influence. the method through which the closed world's institutional interests were pursued in the open world's political dynamics. The deployment was covert, was conducted behind the concealment that the face dance's shape-shifting capability provided, was maintained without the detection that the deployment's exposure would have produced. The concealment connected the face dancers to the planet that produced them, connected the biological product's covert deployment to the institutional culture's comprehensive secrecy. Tlilax was the world of secrets. The face dancers were the secret's instruments. The instrument's deployment was itself a secret. The layers of concealment were the institutional culture's expression, the demonstration that the planet's character was the character of concealment at every level. Arrakis was not one planet across the saga's timeline. The world that appeared in the saga's opening pages was not the world that appeared in the saga's final chapters. Arrakis was changed by the events the saga documented, was transformed by the governance and the ecology and the human activity that the millennia of the saga's narrative encompassed. The Arrakis of the first novel was the desert world, the planet whose conditions have been documented in this narrative's opening sections, the world of sand and worms and spice and Fremen. The planet was hostile, was demanding, was the environment that produced the most capable warriors in the Imperium and the most valuable substance in the known universe. The planet was unchanged, had been the desert for as long as the human records documented, had maintained the conditions the sandworm ecology required with the stability the ecology's self-sustaining life cycle provided. The change began with the Fremen's terraforming program. Pardot Kynes' dream, the ecological transformation of the desert into a green world, had been progressing in the background of the saga's political events, advancing through the patient. Generational effort, the program's timeline specified. The program was planting, was introducing the vegetation that would modify the atmosphere, was collecting the water that would accumulate in the catchment basins the program designed, was progressively changing the conditions the desert had maintained for millennia. Paul's revolution accelerated the change. The political transformation that Paul's ascension produced included the institutional support for the terraforming program that the previous governance had not provided. The Fremen's ecological dream was no longer the covert program of a desert population. It was the policy of an empire, supported by the resources the empire's governance could deploy. The acceleration was significant. The terraforming's pace increased with the institutional support the revolution provided. The terraforming's progress was the ecological crisis's approach. Every hectare of green that the program produced was a hectare of desert that the sandworm ecology lost. Every increment of moisture the atmosphere gained was an increment of aridity the sandworms lost. The terraforming and the ecology were in tension, were competing for the same environmental conditions, each requiring the opposite of what the other required. The green world needed water. The sandworms needed its absence. The God Emperor managed the tension. Leto II's 3,500-year governance included the management of Arrakis's ecology, the calibration of the terraforming's progress to the pace the Golden Path's timeline required, the maintenance of the sandworm population at the levels the spice production demanded, the management of the environmental conditions that both the terraforming and the ecology depended on. The management transformed Arrakis. The desert world that Leto inherited was not the world that Leto's governance produced. The God Emperor's ecological management progressively modified the planet's conditions, introduced water where the desert had been dry, permitted vegetation where the desert had been bare, changed the environment in the directions the governance's purposes specified. The transformation was controlled. Unlike the Fremen's original terraforming program, which would have proceeded to the desert's complete elimination if left unmanaged, the God Emperor's ecological management maintained the balance the Golden Path required. The management kept enough desert for the sandworm's survival, kept enough water for the terraforming's progress, maintained the ecological conditions at the levels the governance's complex purposes demanded. The Idaho River was the transformation's most visible symbol. The body of water present on the transformed Arrakis by the time of the God Emperor's death was the evidence that the desert world was no longer entirely a desert. The river was named for Duncan, Idaho, for the Gola lineage whose presence had accompanied the God Emperor's governance across the millennia. The naming was characteristically Leto, the personal touch in the institutional transformation, the individual acknowledgement in the civilizational project. The God Emperor died in the river. The water that the ecological management had introduced to the desert world was the medium through which the God Emperor's death was accomplished. The water that dissolved the sand trout's skin, that killed the hybrid, that ended the governance that had managed the planet's transformation for 3,500 years. The planet killed the governor through the conditions the governor had created. The irony was complete. The God Emperor had transformed the desert. The transformation produced the water. The water killed the God Emperor. The planet's transformation was the governor's destruction. The conditions the governance had created were the conditions that ended the governance. The post-God Emperor Arrakis was the planet in ecological transition, the world whose conditions were changing from the desert the sandworms required toward the greener environment that terraforming had been producing, without the comprehensive management the God Emperor had provided for the transition's calibration. The sand trout that had been Leto's skin dispersed into the environment. The dispersal was biological. The creatures separated from the dying hybrid's body and entered the ecological system as independent organisms. The creature's dispersal was the God Emperor's final gift to the ecology, the biological material from which the sandworm population would eventually be regenerated, the larvae from which the adult worms would eventually mature. The regeneration took time. The sand trout had to mature. The maturation required the conditions the sand trout's own water encapsulation function would progressively create, the aridification of the areas the sand trout colonized, the progressive recovery of the desert conditions the adult worms required. The regeneration was a process, was measured in decades and centuries rather than in years. Was the biological system's natural response to the biological material the God Emperor's death had provided. The spice production recovered with the sandworm population. The recovery was gradual. The spice's availability increased as the worm population grew, as the ecology's productivity expanded, as the life cycle's ongoing operations generated the melange the civilization depended on. The recovery was sufficient, was adequate for the reduced civilization's demands, was enough to restore the Guild's navigational capability and the CHOAM framework's economic operations to the functional levels the post-scattering landscape required. The recovery was also the planet's return, the return from the managed conditions the God Emperor's governance had produced toward the natural conditions the ecology's self-sustaining life cycle maintained. Arrakis was becoming the desert again, was reverting toward the conditions the sandworm ecology required, was returning to the environmental character the planet had maintained before the terraforming's intervention and the God Emperor's management had modified it. The return was not complete by the saga's final documented events. The Arrakis of Heretics and Chapter House was a planet in transition, carrying the ecological modifications the millennia of management had produced, while undergoing the reversion the unmanaged ecology was generating. The planet was between conditions, was neither the pure desert of the saga's opening, nor the managed hybrid the God-Emperor's governance had maintained. The planet was becoming what the ecology would make it, and the ecology's direction was toward the desert. Arrakis's political significance changed across the saga's timeline in ways that reflected the planet's ecological transformation and the civilization's institutional evolution. In the saga's opening period, Arrakis was the Imperium's most economically important planet, the world whose spice production was the foundation of the civilization's navigational, economic, and social systems. The political significance was economic, was derived from the spice's value, from the revenue the production generated, from the CHOAM framework's management of the commodity's commerce. In Paul's period, Arrakis became the Imperium's political center. Paul governed from Arrakis, made the desert world the seat of the imperial governance, relocated the political center from Kaitain to the planet whose spice production had been the economic foundation and whose Fremen population had been the military instrument of the revolution. The relocation was political, was the expression of the revolution's origins in the desert, the demonstration that the new governance was the desert's governance rather than the old capital's governance. The relocation transformed Arrakis's political character. The desert world that had been the Imperium's most economically important periphery became the Imperium's political center. The transformation was dramatic. The planet that the Corrino dynasty had administered as a remote fief became the planet from which the Atreides governed the known universe. The planet's role changed from the provider of a commodity to the seat of an empire. In the God-Emperor's period, Arrakis was both the political center and the ecological experiment. The planet from which the God-Emperor governed, and the planet on which the God-Emperor's ecological management was conducted. The planet served dual functions, was simultaneously the governance's seat and the governance's laboratory, the location from which the management was directed, and the location on which the management was performed. In the post-God-Emperor period, Arrakis's political significance diminished. The scattering and the famine times fragmented the political landscape, reduced the centralized governance that Arrakis's political centrality had depended on, distributed the political authority across the fragmented landscape that the governance's collapse produced. Arrakis remained important, the spice production's recovery maintained the planet's economic significance, but the planet's political centrality was reduced by the political landscape's fragmentation. Arrakis's trajectory across the saga's timeline was the trajectory of a planet whose significance was always connected to the spice, whose political, economic, and ecological importance was always derived from the substance the planet produced, and from the civilization's dependency on the substance. The trajectory rose and fell with the spice's centrality, rose when the spice was the civilization's unchallenged foundation, fell when the spice's centrality was reduced by the ecological changes and the institutional adaptations the saga's events produced. The relationship between Arrakis and the other planets was the relationship that organized the Imperium's political landscape, and examining the relationship illuminates the structure of the interstellar civilization the saga documented. Arrakis was connected to every world through the spice, the melange's distribution, managed through the CHOAM framework's commercial infrastructure. Transported by the Guild's navigational service, consumed by the populations whose longevity and cognitive enhancement the spice supported, created the economic connections that linked every planet in the Imperium to the desert world. The connections were not bilateral, were not the simple trade relationships that two-party commerce produced. The connections were systemic, were the threads of a network that connected every node to every other node through the spice's distribution and consumption. The network's structure made Arrakis the network's center. not the center in the geographical sense. The planet was not centrally located in the Imperium's spatial distribution. The center in the structural sense, the node through which every other node's connection was mediated, the point in the network whose removal would have collapsed the network's functioning. The vulnerability the structure produced was the vulnerability the saga's events exploited. Paul's threat to destroy the spice, his demonstrated willingness to eliminate the production if his demands were not met, was the exploitation of the network's structural vulnerability. The threat worked because the network's centrality was concentrated, because the removal of Arrakis from the network would have collapsed the network's functioning in every dimension the spice's distribution supported. The vulnerability was also the thing the Golden Path was designed to address. Leto II's 3,500-year governance included the management of the civilization's dependency on the single point of failure the spice's concentration represented. The Golden Path's dispersal was designed to break the network's concentration, to distribute the civilization's survival conditions across enough locations that no single point's removal could collapse the civilization's functioning. The Bene Gesserit's introduction of sandworms to Chapter House was the first step in the concentration's breaking. The first establishment of spice production on a world other than Arrakis. The first diversification of the supply that the concentration's vulnerability demanded. The introduction was significant, demonstrated that the sandworm ecology could be transplanted, that the spice production was not inherently limited to Arrakis, that the dependency's geographical concentration could be reduced through the ecological transplantation. Sheena's departure with sandworms aboard the No ship was the second step, the carrying of the ecology's biological basis into the unknown territories. The provision of the spice production's foundation to whatever destination the No ship reached. The departure distributed the ecology further, extended the potential spice production beyond the old Imperium's boundaries, into the territories the scattering had opened and the No ship's destination would add to. The distribution was the dependency's remedy. The single planet's monopoly on the spice production, the concentration that had made the civilization vulnerable to the single point of failure the concentration represented, was progressively broken by the ecological transplantation that the saga's events documented. The breaking was incomplete by the saga's end, was a process in progress rather than a completed transformation. That the direction was clear, the spice's production was being diversified, the concentration was being reduced, the dependency was being addressed. The unknown worlds, the planets the scattering's dispersed populations, encountered in the territories the Imperium's maps did not include. With the saga's most consequential planetary contribution in its final documented period, and the unknown world's significance was the significance of what the saga did not show. The scattering sent human populations into the uncharted darkness. The populations travelled without maps, without the Guild's navigational charts, without the Imperium's administrative records, without the accumulated knowledge that the known universe's institutional framework provided. The populations found worlds. The populations settled worlds. The populations developed on the worlds they found in conditions the old Imperium's experience had not anticipated. The worlds were various. The scattering's direction was not controlled. The populations dispersed in multiple directions, across multiple distances, finding multiple worlds whose conditions varied with the randomness that uncontrolled exploration generated. Some worlds were habitable, some worlds were hostile, some worlds were abundant, some worlds were scarce. The variety was the scattering's contribution to the species' survival, the diversification of conditions that the Golden Path was designed to produce. The variety produced the variation. The populations that settled different worlds, developed differently, were shaped by the conditions the worlds provided, were formed by the environments the settlements encountered. The development produced new cultures, new institutions, new approaches to the challenges human civilization generated. The development was uncontrolled, was not managed by the comprehensive governance the God Emperor had provided, was not directed by the institutional framework the old Imperium had maintained. The honoured Maters were one product of the development. The faction that returned to the old Imperium with combat capabilities and aggressive expansion was the product of conditions the old Imperium had not produced. Conditions in the Scattering's territories that had shaped the faction's institutional character, that had produced the violence and the desperation the honoured Maters displayed. The conditions were not documented. The saga's texts did not provide the detailed description of the worlds that had produced the honoured Matres's formation. The undocumented conditions were the saga's most significant planetary absence. The worlds that produced the honoured Matres, the environments that shaped the faction's character, the conditions that produced the combat orientation and the sexual enslavement capability and the aggressive expansion the faction demonstrated, were worlds the saga referenced without describing. The absence was deliberate, was the narrative's acknowledgement that the universe exceeded the narrative, that the worlds the story did not show were as consequential as the worlds the story did show. The unknown threat that the honoured Matres were fleeing was associated with the unknown worlds. The threat, the force in the Scattering's territories, whose capabilities exceeded the honoured Matres's ability to resist, was a product of conditions the saga did not document, on worlds the saga did not describe, in territories the saga's maps did not include. The threat's existence demonstrated that the unknown world's conditions had produced something more powerful than anything the old Imperium's institutional landscape contained, something whose capabilities exceeded the honoured Matres's capabilities, which themselves exceeded the old Imperium's conventional capabilities. The unknown worlds were the saga's final argument about the relationship between environment and capability. The argument said, the conditions produce the people. The conditions the Imperium knew produced the people the Imperium knew. The conditions the Imperium did not know produced people the Imperium did not know. The unknown people exceeded the known people's capabilities. The exceedance was the conditions' product, was generated by environments whose demands exceeded what the known environment's demands had produced. The argument extended the saga's planetary logic to its limit. Every planet in the saga produced the people the planet's conditions shaped. Arrakis produced the Fremen. Caladan produced the Atreides. Giedi Prime produced the Harkonnens. Seleucia Secundus produced the Sardaukar. Wallach 9 produced the Bene Gesserit. The unknown worlds produced the unknown people. The logic was consistent, was the same logic applied to every world the saga documented, and to every world the saga did not document. The consistency was the saga's argument. The planets made the people. The argument was universal, applied to every world, to every population, to every condition the universe contained. The argument was also unlimited, extended beyond the saga's documented worlds into the territories the documentation did not encompass, applied to the unknown worlds with the same force it applied to the known worlds, generated the implications the unknown world's conditions would produce with the same reliability it generated the implications the known world's conditions produced. The planets as characters in the saga's narrative is the dimension that the political and ecological analysis should acknowledge, because the worlds were not passive settings, were not the inert backgrounds against which the human drama was performed. The worlds were active participants, were the forces that shaped the drama, that produced the actors, that determined the outcomes. Arrakis was a character. The desert was not simply the location where Paul's transformation occurred. The desert was the agent of the transformation, was the force that stripped away the Caladan formation and imposed the desert formation, that activated the prescient faculty the genetics carried and that the environmental spice saturation triggered, that produced the muad'Dib from the materials the Atreides household had provided. The agency was ecological. The desert did not decide to transform Paul, did not exercise the conscious will that the term agency might suggest in its strongest sense. The desert transformed Paul through the mechanism of the environment's demands, through the conditions that required the adaptation, the challenges that demanded the development, the ecological context that activated the capabilities the genetics had provided. The agency was the agency of conditions rather than the agency of will, was the environment's shaping of the person through the mechanism of the person's response to the environment's demands. Giedi Prime was a character. The industrial world shaped the Harkonnens the way the desert shaped the Fremen, through the mechanism of the environment's demands, through the conditions that required the adaptation, through the ecological context that produced the institutional culture the conditions generated. The industrial world did not decide to produce the exploitation ethic. The industrial world produced the exploitation ethic through the mechanism of the conditions' demands, through the environmental degradation that the industrial economy produced, through the social conditions that the economy's prioritization of output over sustainability generated. Salusa Secundus was a character. The prison planet shaped the Sardaukar the way the desert shaped the Fremen, and the industrial world shaped the Harkonnens, through the mechanism of the environmental hardening, through the conditions that filtered the capable from the incapable, through the ecological demands that produced the military capability the conditions generated. Every planet was a character. Every world that the saga documented was an active participant in the narrative, was a force that shaped the events through the mechanism of the conditions the world provided and the people the conditions produced. The narrative was not performed on the planets. The narrative was produced by the planets, was generated by the conditions the worlds provided and the people the conditions shaped and the interactions the people's encounters produced. The planetary system as a whole, the network of worlds that the Imperium's civilization occupied and that the saga's narrative encompassed, was the system whose dynamics produced the saga's events. The system was organized around the spice. Arrakis's spice production was the system's center, the economic and navigational foundation that the system's connections depended on. The system's other worlds were organized in relation to the center, were connected to the center through the spice's distribution, were affected by the center's conditions through the dependency the distribution created. The system was hierarchical. Not all worlds were equally significant. The system's structure included the distinction between the center and the periphery, between the worlds whose conditions made them consequential for the system's functioning and the worlds whose conditions made them marginal. Arrakis was the center. Kaitain was the political hub. Giedi Prime and Caladan were the major houses' bases. Salusa Secundus was the military's source. Ix and Tlilax were the technology and biology providers. Wallachnorn was the training's location. The hierarchy reflected the world's contributions to the system's functioning, the positions the worlds occupied in the network the system's connections constituted. The hierarchy was also the vulnerability. The system's concentration, the dependence on the center, the reliance on the hub, the connection through the single substance, made the system vulnerable to the disruption of the elements the concentration depended on. The vulnerability was demonstrated repeatedly across the saga's timeline, was demonstrated by Paul's threat to destroy the spice, by the God Emperor's control of the supply, by the famine times spice shortage, by every event that threatened the center the system was organized around. The Golden Path's dispersal was the system's restructuring, the breaking of the hierarchical concentration, the distribution of the system's elements across conditions that reduced the vulnerability the concentration produced. The dispersal did not eliminate the system, did not destroy the connections that made the interstellar civilization function. The dispersal diversified the system, distributed the connections across enough locations that no single disruption could collapse the system's functioning. The planetary system's trajectory across the saga's timeline was the trajectory from concentration to diversification, from the hierarchical organization around the single center to the distributed organization across multiple locations. The trajectory was the Golden Path's direction. The trajectory was the species' survival's requirement. The trajectory was produced by the events the saga documented, by the revolution and the jihad and the God Emperor's governance and the scattering that the governance produced. The trajectory was incomplete. The saga's final documented events showed a system that was in transition, that had begun the diversification the Golden Path required, but that had not completed the diversification the species' survival demanded. The system was between conditions, between the concentrated organization the Imperium had maintained, and the diversified organization the Golden Path specified. The system was becoming what the survival required. The system had not yet become it. The saga's philosophical argument about planets, the argument the planetary analysis reveals when the analysis encompasses the full scope of the saga's documented worlds, is the argument that environment determines civilization, and that civilization's determinacy is the condition the species' survival must address. The argument said, the conditions shape the people. Arrakis shapes the Fremen, Caladan shapes the Atreides, Giedi Prime shapes the Harkonnens, Seleucia Secundus shapes the Sardaukar. Every world shapes the people who inhabit it through the mechanism of the conditions the world provides and the adaptations the conditions demand. The argument also said, the shaped people shape the world. The Fremen's terraforming reshapes Arrakis. The Harkonnens' exploitation degrades Giedi Prime. The God Emperor's management transforms the desert. The Bene Gesserit's ecological transplantation creates new deserts on new worlds. The people the worlds produce modify the worlds that produce them. The reciprocity was the argument's deepest dimension. The relationship between the world and the people was not unidirectional, was not the simple determination of the people by the conditions. The relationship was reciprocal. The conditions shaped the people, and the people reshaped the conditions. The environment produced the civilization, and the civilization modified the environment. The determination and the modification were continuous, were ongoing, were the sustained interaction between the world and the people the world had produced. The reciprocity produced the instability. The modification of the environment by the people the environment had produced changed the conditions that had produced the people, and the changed conditions produced different people, and the different people produced different modifications, and the modifications changed the conditions again. The cycle was continuous. The cycle was destabilizing. The cycle was the mechanism through which the stability the political governance was designed to maintain was progressively undermined by the ecological dynamics the governance could not fully control. The instability was the challenge the saga's governance traditions were tested against. The Corrino dynasty's governance maintained the political stability, maintained the institutional framework that managed the political landscape's dynamics. The governance did not maintain the ecological stability, did not manage the environmental conditions that the political landscape depended on, did not address the ecological dynamics that the political framework's stability was vulnerable to. The God Emperor's governance addressed the ecological stability alongside the political stability, maintained the environmental conditions the civilization required while managing the political dynamics the civilization generated. The comprehensiveness was the governance's achievement. The comprehensiveness was also the governance's cost. Was produced through the authoritarianism that the environmental management's demands required, was maintained through the sacrifice that the governance's duration imposed on the governor. The saga's planetary argument concluded that the species' survival required ecological management, required the governance of the environmental conditions alongside the governance of the political dynamics, required the attention to the worlds as well as the attention to the people the worlds produced. The conclusion was the ecological argument's expression in the planetary analysis, the demonstration that the worlds were not passive settings but active participants whose management was as consequential as the management of the political landscape they contained. The planet that the saga's argument ultimately pointed toward was the planet that did not yet exist, the planet that the scattering's dispersed populations would eventually find, the world whose conditions would produce the people the species' survival required. The planet was in the unknown territories. The planet was on the no-ship's trajectory. The planet was in the direction the dispersal was heading, in the territories the maps did not include, in the conditions the old Imperium's experience had not documented. The planet's conditions were unknown. The conditions might be harsh, might produce the hardening that the desert and the prison planet had produced in the saga's documented worlds. The conditions might be abundant, might produce the service ethic that Caladan's conditions had generated. The conditions might be different from anything the documented worlds had provided, might produce adaptations and institutions and capabilities that the documented world's experiences did not anticipate. The unknown planet was the Golden Path's destination, the world where the dispersed populations would settle, where the prescient's immune genetics would develop in the conditions the settlement provided, where the species' survival would be maintained through the diversification the single world's concentration could not support. The destination was uncertain. The Golden Path's prescient design specified the direction, specified the dispersal, the diversification, the breaking of the concentration. The design did not specify the destination, did not identify the worlds the dispersal would reach, did not describe the conditions the settlements would encounter, did not anticipate the adaptations the conditions would produce. The uncertainty was the Golden Path's condition. The path was designed to produce the survival through the diversification's mechanism, through the distribution of populations across enough conditions that no single event could threaten the species' survival. The mechanism did not require the destination's identification. The mechanism required only the dispersal's occurrence and the dispersal's comprehensiveness. The planets the species would find were the planets the species' future depended on. The planets the saga documented, Arrakis, Caladan, Giedi Prime, Seleucia Secundus, Kaitain, Ix, Tlilax, Wallach 9, Chapter House, were the planets the species' past had been shaped by. The planets the species would find were the planets the species' future would be shaped by. The saga's planetary narrative moved from the known to the unknown, from the documented worlds whose conditions and whose contributions the narrative could describe to the undocumented worlds whose conditions and whose contributions the narrative could only anticipate. The movement was the species movement, was the trajectory from the concentrated occupation of the known toward the diversified occupation of the unknown. The movement was the saga's final planetary argument. The worlds that made the species what it was were not the worlds that would save the species. The worlds that would save the species were the worlds the species had not yet found. The salvation was in the unknown. The salvation was in the finding. The salvation was in the encounter between the species and the conditions the species had not yet experienced. The most important planets in the Dune universe included the planets the saga did not name. The known worlds shaped the species' history. The unknown worlds would shape the species' future. The planets were the characters. The species was the story. The story continued beyond the documented worlds, into the territories the maps did not include, toward the planets the saga's narrative could not reach. The most important planets in the Dune universe. The ones that were documented. The ones that were not. The worlds that made the history. The worlds that would make the future. Lankyvale was the world the Harkonnens tried to forget. The ancestral Harkonnen planet whose conditions and whose character were so different from the industrial powerhouse of Giedi Prime that the dynasty's institutional memory preferred to minimize the connection. Lankyvale was cold. The planet's climate was subarctic. A world of ice and ocean and the fishing economy that the planet's conditions supported. The population was modest. The economy was modest. The planet's political significance was the significance of a minor world in a minor position within the Landsraad's hierarchy. The Harkonnens' connection to Lankyvale was the connection of origin, the ancestral claim that the House maintained even after the House's power had been relocated to Giedi Prime, the nominal governance of the homeworld that the House's institutional identity included. Rabban, the Baron's nephew, Glossu Rabban, the beast who would govern Arrakis during the Baron's two-phase plan, held the Lankyvale fief as part of the family's governance portfolio. The contrast between Lankyvale and Giedi Prime was the contrast between what the Harkonnens had been and what the Harkonnens had become. Lankyvale was the fishing world, the modest, cold, economically unremarkable planet that the House's early history had been connected to. Giedi Prime was the industrial world, the wealthy, polluted, politically significant planet that the House's current power was based in. The distance between the two worlds was the distance the House had travelled in its institutional development, from the cold fisheries to the industrial empire, from the modest economy to the dominant commercial position. The distance was also the distance the House had travelled in its moral development. Lankyvale's fishing economy did not produce the exploitation ethic that Giedi Prime's industrial economy generated. The fishing world's conditions did not demand the instrumental treatment of populations that the industrial world's production pressures imposed. The Harkonnens of Lankyvale would have been different from the Harkonnens of Giedi Prime, would have been shaped by different conditions, formed by different demands, produced by different environments. The institutional evolution from Lankyvale to Giedi Prime was the evolution the saga's planetary argument documented in its Harkonnen dimension. The demonstration that the House's character was the product of the world the House inhabited, that the move from one world to another was the move from one institutional character to another, that the change of environment was the change of the institution the environment produced. Richese was Ix's rival, the other technology world whose engineering tradition competed with the Ixian tradition for the Imperium's commercial and institutional markets. The rivalry between Ix and Richese was the Imperium's primary technology competition. The sustained institutional contest between two engineering traditions whose products served the civilization's technological demands. The rivalry was commercial. The two worlds competed for the contracts, the commissions, the institutional relationships that the technology markets provided. The rivalry was also intellectual. The two traditions competed for the innovative edge that the technology development required, each pushing the other toward the advancement the competition's pressure generated. Richese's position in the rivalry had diminished across the centuries documented in the saga's narrative. The Ixian tradition's engineering had progressively exceeded the Richesian tradition's engineering in the dimensions the market valued: the innovation, the reliability, the cost-effectiveness that the technology's consumers assessed. The diminishment was not absolute. Richese continued to produce technology, continued to maintain the engineering tradition the planet's institutional culture sustained. But the diminishment was real. The Ixian products were preferred, the Ixian contracts were larger, the Ixian institutional relationships were more consequential. The diminishment was the planet's institutional trajectory, the progression from a position of competitive parity with Ix to a position of competitive inferiority. The trajectory reflected the institutional dynamics that the technology competition generated, the advantages that the Ixian tradition's institutional culture provided versus the Richesian tradition's more conventional approach to the technology development. The rivalry demonstrated the saga's argument about institutional competition in its technological dimension. The demonstration that the competition's dynamics were shaped by the institution's characters, that the institution's characters were shaped by the planet's conditions, that the planetary conditions' influence extended through the institutions to the competition's outcomes. The Guild's relationship with specific planets was the relationship of an institution whose operational character was defined by the absence of planetary attachment, the institution that was everywhere and nowhere, that served every world without being committed to any world, that maintained the neutrality the navigational monopolies' political function required. The Guild did not have a homeworld in the way the other institutions did. The Guild operated from its ships and its stations, from the navigational infrastructure that the Guild's operations required, rather than from the planetary base that the other institutions' operations were organized around. The Guild's institutional identity was not planetary, was not connected to a world the way the Bene Gesserit's identity was connected to Wallach 9, or the Corrinos' identity was connected to Kaitain. The absence of planetary attachment was the Guild's most consequential institutional characteristic. The attachment to a world produced the vulnerability that the world's conditions imposed, the dependency on the world's environment, the susceptibility to the world's disruption, the limitation of the institutional perspective to the worldview the world's conditions generated. The Guild's freedom from planetary attachment was the Guild's freedom from these vulnerabilities, was the institutional independence that the navigational monopolies' political function required. The freedom was also the limitation. The Guild, without a planetary base, was without the cultural grounding that the planetary attachment provided, without the environmental formation that shaped the other institutions' characters, without the ecological awareness that the planetary conditions management produced, without the civilizational depth that the sustained relationship with a single world's conditions generated. The Guild's institutional character reflected the absence. The navigators, the spice-transformed beings whose prescient perception guided the ships through fold space, were disconnected from planetary experience in the most literal sense. The navigators lived in their navigation tanks, in the spice-saturated environments that the navigation function required, separated from the planetary conditions that the non-navigational populations experienced. The navigators did not walk on worlds. The navigators did not breathe the atmospheres the worlds provided. The navigators existed in the tanks the navigation required, and the tank's conditions were the navigator's environment. The disconnection was the navigation's price. The capability that the spice transformation produced, the prescient perception that made the fold space travel safe, was produced at the cost of the planetary experience that the non-transformed consciousness maintained. The navigators could guide ships between worlds. The navigators could not experience the worlds the ships travelled between. The capability and the disconnection were inseparable, were the two dimensions of the transformation the spice produced. The Guild's planets, the worlds the Guild maintained for the institutional operations the navigation service required, were functional rather than cultural. The Guild's worlds served the maintenance of the ships, the training of the navigators, the management of the commercial relationships the navigation service generated. The worlds were infrastructure, were the physical locations the operations required, rather than the cultural bases the institutional identity was grounded in. The Guild's relationship with Arrakis was the Guild's most consequential planetary relationship. The relationship was the dependency, the Guild's need for the spice the desert world produced, the navigational functions requirement for the substance the sandworm ecology generated. The dependency connected the Guild to Arrakis with a bond that exceeded any other planetary connection the Guild maintained. A bond that was not cultural but biochemical, not institutional but ecological, not chosen but imposed by the navigation function's biological requirements. The bond was the Guild's vulnerability. The institution that was free from every other planetary attachment was bonded to Arrakis by the spice dependency the navigation function imposed. The freedom from planetary attachment was contradicted by the dependency on the single planet whose substance the navigation required. The Guild was everywhere and nowhere. The Guild was also, through the dependency at Arrakis, was connected to the desert world by the biochemical bond the spice created. The daily life on the saga's documented planets was the dimension the political and institutional analysis tended to overlook, but that the world's human significance depended on. The ordinary experience of the populations who inhabited the worlds and whose existence constituted the civilizational fabric the governance administered. The daily life on Arrakis for the Fremen, for the settled populations, for the administrators and the workers the spice operation employed, was the daily life of a desert. The stillsuit was worn from morning. The water was managed from the day's beginning to the day's end. The temperature's extremes were navigated through the timing of the activities, the work conducted in the cooler periods, the rest taken during the heat's peak. The worms were monitored, the sand was watched for the vibration patterns that indicated the creature's approach, the daily activities calibrated to the worm's movement patterns. The daily life on Caladan was the daily life of an ocean world. The fishing economy organized the coastal population's activities. The boats went out, the catches were brought in. The processing and the distribution were conducted through the commercial infrastructure the economy maintained. The agriculture organized the inland population's activities. The crops were planted and harvested on the schedules the climate determined. The livestock were maintained in the conditions the world's ecology supported. The daily life was temperate, was conducted in conditions that the human body tolerated without the technological mediation the desert demanded. The daily life on Giedi Prime was the daily life of an industrial world. The factories organized the working population's activities. The shifts were scheduled, the production quotas were maintained. The industrial output was generated through the labor the economy consumed. The pollution colored the daily experience. The air was marked by the industrial output's byproducts. The light was filtered through the atmospheric conditions the industry generated. The environment bore the visible evidence of the economy's impact. The daily life on Seleucia Secundus was the daily life of a prison world and a training ground. The prisoner's daily experience was the experience of environmental hardship, the conditions that killed the unprepared and that hardened the survivors through the survival's demands. The Sardaukar recruit's daily experience was the experience of military training applied to the environmental hardening, the transformation of the survival's products into the military capability the training refined. The daily lives were different because the worlds were different. The difference was the saga's argument, the demonstration that the daily experience of existence was shaped by the conditions the existence was conducted in, that the ordinary texture of life on one world was profoundly different from the ordinary texture of life on another world, that the difference in the texture was the difference in the people the texture produced. The population's daily lives were the foundation on which the saga's events were built. The revolution was built on the Fremen's daily hardship. The dynasty was built on the Sardaukar's daily training. The Harkonnen governance was built on the population's daily labour. The Atreides governance was built on the population's daily comfort. The daily lives were not the dramatic events the narrative focused on. The daily lives were the conditions that produced the dramatic events, the foundation from which the events emerged, and to which the events' consequences returned. The cultural products the worlds generated, the arts, the traditions, the social practices that the populations developed in the conditions the worlds provided, were the dimensions that connected the environmental analysis to the human experience the analysis was supposed to illuminate. The Fremen's cultural productions were the desert's cultural products, the water ceremonies, the rituals that managed the community's water resources with the precision the desert demanded. The Sietch architecture, the underground communities designed to protect the inhabitants from the surface conditions the desert imposed, the worm-riding tradition, the practice of mounting and riding the sandworms, the skill that connected the Fremen to the ecology's dominant organism in the relationship of use and respect the tradition maintained. The Fremen's oral tradition was the desert's intellectual product. The stories the Fremen told, the histories, the legends, the accounts of the community's past that the oral tradition maintained were stories shaped by the desert's conditions. The stories were about water. The stories were about survival. The stories were about the relationship between the people and the environment the people inhabited. The desert was the story's setting and the story's subject, the condition that the stories were told in and the condition the stories were told about. The Atreides' cultural traditions were Caladan's cultural products. The maritime traditions, the practices connected to the ocean, the sailing, the fishing that the waterworld's conditions supported, the music, the balisette tradition that Gurney Halleck carried, the musical expression that the Caladan household's cultural richness provided the leisure and the conditions to develop. The Harkonnen cultural productions were Giedi Prime's industrial products. The gladiatorial arenas, the entertainment that the industrial population's need for distraction produced, the managed violence that the governance provided as the substitute for the political participation the governance denied. The arena's culture was the industrial world's leisure, the recreation that the production's rhythms allowed, the emotional release that the production's pressures demanded. The cultural products demonstrated the planetary argument in its creative dimension. The worlds produced not only the people and the institutions, but the cultures, the creative expressions, the artistic traditions, the social practices that the populations developed in the conditions the worlds provided. The cultures were the world's signatures, the evidence of the conditions' influence on the human consciousness that the conditions shaped. the demonstration that the environment's impact extended beyond the physical and the institutional to the creative and the spiritual. The planetary system's economic architecture was the architecture that connected the world's individual economies to the interstellar civilization's collective economy, and the architecture's character illuminated the saga's argument about economic dependency and economic vulnerability. The CHOAM framework organized the interstellar commerce. The framework managed the production, the distribution, and the consumption of the goods the civilization's hundreds of worlds generated and required. The management was institutional, was conducted through the commercial organization's administrative apparatus, was governed by the shareholding structure that the framework's founding had established. The framework's architecture was hub and spoke. The commercial connections ran through the CHOAM administration, through the framework's institutional infrastructure, through the commercial channels the organization maintained. The architecture concentrated the commerce's management, placed the management's control in the institution's administrative center, organized the commercial activity around the institution's oversight. The spice was the architecture's most consequential commodity. The melange's distribution was managed through the CHOAM framework, was conducted through the commercial channels the organization maintained, was priced by the supply and demand dynamics the framework's markets generated. The spice's management was the framework's most important function, was the commercial relationship that generated the most revenue, that attracted the most institutional attention, that produced the most consequential political dynamics. The economic architecture's planetary dimension was the dimension that connected the individual world's economies to the collective system's functioning. Each world contributed its products. Arrakis contributed the spice, Giedi Prime contributed the industrial output, Ix contributed the technology, other worlds contributed the agricultural products, the raw materials, the manufactured goods the civilization required. Each world received the products it needed, the spice from Arrakis, the technology from Ix, the manufactured goods from the industrial worlds, the food from the agricultural worlds. The exchange was the civilization's economic substance, was the ongoing flow of goods and services that the interstellar commerce maintained. The flow was managed by CHOAM. The flow was transported by the guild. The flow was taxed by the emperor. The flow was consumed by the populations. The flow was the economic expression of the interstellar connections the political framework maintained. The flow's vulnerability was the spice's concentration. The flow depended on the navigational capability the spice provided, depended on the guild's ability to transport the goods the commerce required, which depended on the navigator's prescient perception, which depended on the spice the navigators consumed. The flow was contingent on the desert world's ecology, was sustained by the sandworm life cycle's operation, was vulnerable to the life cycle's disruption. Every commercial transaction in the Imperium was ultimately dependent on the biological processes of an organism on a single world. The vulnerability was the economic argument's expression, the demonstration that the civilization's economy was as vulnerable as the civilization's navigation, that the economic connections the commerce maintained were as fragile as the navigational connections the spice sustained, that the interstellar civilization's economic functioning was contingent on the ecological conditions of a single planet. The most important planets in the Dune universe were important because the civilization depended on them, because the civilization's functioning was contingent on the conditions the planets provided and the products the conditions generated. The importance was not honorary, the importance was structural, was built into the civilization's architecture at every level. was expressed in the economic connections and the political dynamics and the institutional relationships the architecture maintained. The planets were the civilization's foundation. The foundation's character determined the civilization's character. The foundation's vulnerability determined the civilization's vulnerability. The foundation's transformation determined the civilization's transformation. The worlds made the civilization. The civilization depended on the worlds. The dependency was the story. The most important planets in the Dune universe were the planets the story depended on. Every one of them. The transformative moments in each planet's documented history were the moments that changed the world's conditions and the world's significance within the interstellar system. And documenting these moments illuminates the relationship between the planetary and the political that the saga sustained. Arrakis' transformative moments were the most numerous and the most consequential, reflecting the planet's centrality to the saga's narrative. The first transformation was Pardot Kynes' arrival, the moment at which the imperial planetologists' scientific assessment of the desert ecology produced the terraforming dream that would progressively modify the planet's environmental conditions. The arrival introduced the idea that the desert could be changed, that the conditions the sandworm ecology maintained were not permanent, that the human intervention the planetologists' understanding made possible could transform the planet from what it was to what the Fremen wanted it to be. The second transformation was Paul's arrival. The Atreides transfer placed on the desert the people whose encounter with the desert would produce the revolution, placed the Caladan formed values in the desert's conditions, creating the collision between environment and institution that the revolution expressed. Paul's arrival was not simply a political event, was not simply the transfer of a governance responsibility from one house to another. Paul's arrival was an ecological event, was the introduction of a new element into the desert's human ecology. An element whose interaction with the existing elements would produce consequences the existing ecology had not generated. The third transformation was the revolution itself. The battle for Arrakis transformed Arrakis from a governed fief into an imperial seat, changed the planet's political function from the production of a commodity to the administration of a civilization. The transformation was dramatic, was the most rapid change in a planet's political function the saga documented, accomplished in the single afternoon that the Fremen assault required. The fourth transformation was the God Emperor's ecological management. The 3,500-year governance progressively modified the planet's conditions, introduced water, permitted vegetation, changed the desert's character in the directions the governance's purposes specified. The transformation was the most sustained environmental modification the saga documented, was conducted across millennia rather than across years or decades, was managed with the comprehensive attention the God Emperor's transformed consciousness provided. The fifth transformation was the God Emperor's death and the ecological transition it produced. The sand trout's dispersal into the environment, the worm's progressive regeneration, the desert's gradual return, these were the transformation's dimensions in the post-God Emperor period. The transformation was the planet's return. The reversion toward the conditions the sandworm ecology naturally maintained, conducted without the comprehensive management the God Emperor had provided. Each transformation built on the previous transformation's consequences. The terraforming dream produced the conditions Paul encountered. Paul's revolution produced the conditions the God Emperor inherited. The God Emperor's management produced the conditions the death disrupted. The death's disruption produced the conditions the regeneration addressed. The chain of transformation was continuous, was the planet's history, expressed through the changes the human activity generated and the ecology processed. Caladan's transformative moment was its loss. The departure of the Atreides household, the transfer to Arrakis that the Emperor's conspiracy had arranged, was the event that changed Caladan's significance from the homeworld of one of the Imperium's most admired houses to the former homeworld of a destroyed family. The loss was not physical. Caladan was not damaged by the Atreides' departure. The planet's conditions were unchanged. The environment was unaffected. The population continued to inhabit the world the Atreides had governed. The loss was political, was the removal of the house that had given the planet its significance, the departure of the institutional culture that had made Caladan's governance the standard the Landsraad admired. The post-Atreides Caladan was governed by other houses, by the administrators the fief system assigned to the planet after the Atreides' removal. The governance was adequate. The governance was not the Atreides' governance, was not the service tradition the house had maintained, was not the institutional culture that had made the planet's governance the Landsraad's admiration. The planet persisted. The planet's significance diminished. The significance had been the Atreides' contribution, and the contribution departed with the house. Caladan's loss demonstrated the saga's argument about the relationship between the planet and the institution. The planet's conditions had produced the Atreides' values. The values had given the planet its significance. The values' departure removed the significance. The planet remained. The significance did not. The planet's conditions could produce another institution. The planet's conditions could not reproduce the institution the conditions had previously produced, because the institution's development included the historical contingencies and the individual characters that the conditions alone could not replicate. Giedi Prime's transformative moments were the moments of the Harkonnen house's political trajectory. The moments at which the house's position changed and the planet's relationship to the interstellar system was modified by the change. The Baron's governance was Giedi Prime's defining period, the decades during which the planet's character was shaped by the Baron's institutional vision, during which the industrial economy was optimized for the production the Baron's governance prioritized, during which the population's conditions were managed according to the instrumentalist ethic the Baron's approach embodied. The Harkonnen house's destruction at Arrakis, the loss of the Baron, the loss of Feyd-Rautha, the loss of Raban, the elimination of the house's political leadership in the revolution's military and political events, was Giedi Prime's most consequential moment. The destruction removed the governance that had given the planet its institutional character, removed the Baron's vision, the Baron's management, the Baron's exploitation that had shaped the planet's conditions across decades of industrial governance. The post-Harkonnen Giedi Prime was a planet without its defining institution. The industrial infrastructure remained. The population remained. The environmental degradation remained. The governance that had organized the infrastructure and the population and had produced the degradation was gone, was eliminated by the revolution's destruction of the house that had provided the governance. The planet's trajectory after the house's destruction was the trajectory of an industrial world without its industrial master, a world whose economic capability continued to operate through the institutional momentum the governance had generated, but whose direction was no longer determined by the governance's vision. The trajectory was uncertain, was shaped by the political dynamics the post-revolution landscape generated, rather than by the consistent vision the Harkonnen governance had provided. Seleucus Secundus's transformative moment was the exile, the moment at which the former Corrino homeworld, the Sardaukar training ground, the prison planet that had maintained the dynasty's military force for 10,000 years, became the exile's destination for the dynasty's last ruler. The exile transformed Seleucus Secundus from a tool to a home, from the planet the dynasty used to the planet the dynasty lived on. The transformation was ironic. The planet whose conditions had been maintained for the Sardaukars' production became the planet whose conditions the dynasty's last ruler had to endure. The tool's user became the tool's inhabitant. The administrator became the administered. The exile's duration extended across the centuries, across the regency, the god-emperor's governance, the famine times, the post-scattering era. The Corrino house maintained itself on Seleucus Secundus across the millennia of reduced circumstances the exile imposed, preserving the institutional identity the 10,000-year dynasty had produced in the conditions the prison planet provided. The institutional persistence was Seleucus Secundus's contribution to the Corrino story. The planet that had produced the Sardaukar through its environmental harshness produced the Corrino house's institutional resilience through the same harshness. The conditions that hardened soldiers also hardened the institution, also forged the institutional culture's capacity for endurance through the conditions' demands, also refined the house's patience through the sustained environmental pressure the exile imposed. The political geography of the Imperium, the spatial distribution of the planets and the political dynamics the distribution generated, was the dimension that connected the individual planets' stories to the interstellar system's collective narrative. The Imperium's political geography was organized around distance. The distance between worlds, measured not in spatial units, but in navigational complexity, in the guild's transportation schedules, in the communication delays the interstellar distances imposed, was the political geography's primary variable. Worlds that were close to the centers of political activity, close to Kaitain, close to the court, close to the commercial hubs the CHOAM framework maintained, were worlds whose political influence reflected the proximity's advantages. Worlds that were distant from the centers were worlds whose political influence reflected the distance's disadvantages. The distance affected governance, the imperial government's administrative reach, the capacity to govern, to monitor, to manage the worlds the administration was responsible for, diminished with distance. The worlds closest to the administrative center received the most administrative attention. The worlds furthest from the center received the least. The gradient of attention was the political geography's most consequential feature, the feature that determined which worlds were well governed and which were under-governed, which worlds' conditions were monitored and which worlds' conditions were overlooked. Arrakis was distant. The desert world, the Imperium's most economically important planet, was far from the political centers the administration occupied. The distance contributed to the governance failures the saga documented, the failure to assess the Fremen's capability, the failure to monitor the ecology's vulnerability, the failure to understand the conditions on the planet the governance was responsible for. The distance was not the sole cause of the failures. The distance was the condition that made the failures possible, the condition that reduced the administrative attention to the level where the failures could occur without detection. The distance also protected. The Fremen's concealment, the maintenance of the deep desert population's invisibility to the administrative assessment, was facilitated by the distance that separated Arrakis from the political centers. The distance made the monitoring difficult. The difficult monitoring made the concealment possible. The concealment maintained the Fremen's capability in the invisibility that the administrative distance provided. The Guild's navigational service connected the worlds across the distances the political geography imposed. The navigational connections were the civilization's circulatory system. the mechanism through which the goods, the people, the information, the political authority that the civilization required were transported across the interstellar distances that separated the civilization's worlds. The connections were not equal. The guild's service allocation, the determination of which routes received service and which routes did not, was the navigational geography's most consequential administrative decision. The routes that received frequent service were the routes that sustained the political and economic connections the civilization's functioning required. The routes that received infrequent service were the routes whose connections were maintained at reduced levels, whose worlds were partially isolated by the service's reduction. The service allocation was political. The guild's decisions about which routes to serve were informed by the political and economic significance of the route's endpoints, by the assessment of which connections the civilization's functioning required, and which connections the civilization's functioning could tolerate the reduction of. The assessment was the guild's institutional judgment, was the determination the guild's institutional interests and the guild's institutional assessment produced. The political geography's most consequential feature was the feature the saga's events demonstrated repeatedly: the distance and the isolation that the political geography imposed produced the conditions under which the surprises occurred. The Fremen's invisibility was the distance's product. The honoured mattress's emergence was the scattering's distance's product. The unknown threat's existence was the unknown territory's distance's product. Every major surprise the saga documented was a surprise that distance had made possible, a consequence that the political geography's isolation had concealed from the centre's observation until the consequence emerged from the isolation with the force the concealment had allowed it to accumulate. The deep ecology of the sandworm life cycle deserves the extended treatment the ecology's centrality to the saga's planetary argument demands, because the life cycle was the mechanism that connected the planet's conditions to the civilization's functioning. The life cycle's deepest dimension was the life cycle's age. The sandworm ecology had been operating on Arrakis for millennia, had been maintaining the desert conditions, generating the spice, sustaining the life cycle's biological processes across timescales that exceeded the human civilization's presence on the planet. The ecology was older than the governance. The ecology was older than the human habitation. The ecology was the planet's defining feature long before the human institutions the saga documented had arrived. The ecology's age raised the question the saga did not fully answer: where had the sandworms come from? The creatures were not native to Arrakis in the sense that the creatures had always existed on the planet. The geological evidence suggested that Arrakis had not always been a desert, that the desert conditions were themselves the product of the sandworm ecology's operation. The sandtrout's water encapsulation had created the desert, had sequestered the water that would otherwise have sustained a wetter environment, had produced the arid conditions the adult worms required. The question of the ecology's origin was the question of how the cycle had started, how the first sandtrout had arrived on the planet, how the first water encapsulation had begun, how the desert had been created from whatever conditions had preceded it. The question was not answered in the saga's documented texts. The question was present, was implied by the ecology's described mechanisms, was suggested by the geological indicators the texts referenced. The absence of the answer was the saga's acknowledgement that the ecology exceeded the documentation, that the life cycle's history extended beyond the narrative's reach into the deep time the documentation could not encompass. The life cycle's resilience was demonstrated by the ecology's recovery after the God Emperor's death. The sandtrout that dispersed from Leto's body, the larvae that entered the environment and began the water encapsulation process that would progressively restore the desert conditions, demonstrated that the life cycle could regenerate from minimal biological material. The recovery demonstrated the ecology's robustness, the capacity for the self-sustaining cycle to restart from a reduced starting point, to rebuild the conditions the cycle required through the cycle's own operations. The recovery was the ecology's final gift to the saga's narrative, the demonstration that the life cycle was resilient enough to survive the interventions the human activity had imposed, that the ecology could regenerate the conditions the governance had modified, that the desert would return regardless of the modifications the management had produced. The desert was patient. The desert was persistent. The desert would be the desert again, because the ecology that made the desert was the ecology that survived the management. The patience was the ecology's deepest character. The sandworm life cycle operated on timescales that exceeded the human governance's timescales, maintained the conditions through processes that were measured in centuries rather than in decades, that were sustained by the biological mechanisms rather than by the institutional management, that were resilient against the interventions the human activity produced, because the biological processes' timescales exceeded the interventions' timescales. The ecology's patience was the saga's ecological argument in its most concentrated form, the demonstration that the natural system's timescale exceeded the human system's timescale, that the ecology's processes would outlast the governance's interventions, that the desert would be the desert again, because the biology that made the desert operated on timescales the politics could not match. The most important planet in the Dune universe was the planet whose ecology was more patient than the civilization that inhabited it. Arrakis was the center. Arrakis was the constant. Arrakis was the planet that waited. The water economy of Arrakis was the most developed economic system the saga documented at the resource level, and examining the economy illuminates the relationship between planetary conditions and economic organization that the saga's broader argument sustained. Water on Arrakis was not simply scarce. Water on Arrakis was the medium of exchange, the currency through which the desert's transactions were conducted, the store of value that the community's wealth was measured in, the unit of account that the economic activity's pricing was denominated in. Water was money. The statement was not metaphorical. The Fremen's economic system was organized around water with the same comprehensiveness that the Imperium's economy was organized around the spice. The Sietch communities maintained water reserves. The reserves were the community's wealth, the accumulated capital that the water discipline's sustained practice had generated across generations of the discipline's operation. The reserves were stored in underground catchment basins, the excavated chambers whose sealed walls prevented the water's evaporation and whose placement beneath the desert's surface protected the reserves from the environmental conditions that would have dissipated the water's availability. The reserves were managed collectively. The Sietch's water was the Sietch's property, was owned by the community rather than by individual members, was managed through the communal governance the Sietch's social structure provided. The communal ownership was the water discipline's institutional expression. The governance mechanism that ensured the water's management served the community's survival rather than the individual's accumulation. The water of the dead was the economy's most distinctive element. When a Fremen died, the body's water was reclaimed by the community, was extracted from the corpse through the death stills mechanism, and returned to the Sietch's reserves. The reclamation was the community's right, was the expression of the communal ownership that the water discipline maintained, the demonstration that the individual's water was the community's water, and that the community's claim extended to the water the individual's body contained. The practice was the desert's morality made economic, the conditions that made water valuable, the scarcity that made every drop consequential, produced the economic practice that the conditions required. The practice was not cruel, was not the expression of disregard for the deceased. The practice was the expression of the conditions' demands, the recognition that the community's survival depended on the water the conditions made available, and that the available water included the water the community's members' bodies contained. The water economy connected the Fremen to the planet in the most intimate way the saga documented. The economy was the planet's product, was generated by the conditions the desert imposed, was organized around the resource the desert made valuable, was maintained through the practices the desert's conditions required. The economy was also the Fremen's product, was the institutional response the Fremen had developed to the conditions the desert imposed, was the creative adaptation that the Fremen's civilizational capability had produced in response to the challenges the environment presented. The economy's integrity was threatened by the terraforming. The dream of a green Arrakis, the ecological transformation that would introduce water to the desert's surface, would have destroyed the water economy's foundation. The water's scarcity was the economy's basis. The scarcity's elimination would have eliminated the economy, would have made the water discipline unnecessary, the reserves superfluous, the practices obsolete. The dream was the economy's dissolution. The Fremen's willingness to pursue the terraforming despite the economy's dissolution was the demonstration of the dream's cultural power. The evidence that the Fremen valued the green world more than they valued the economic system the desert world had produced. The dream was more important than the economy. The future was more important than the present. The transformation was more important than the preservation. The willingness was also the tragedy. The economy the Fremen were willing to dissolve was the economy that had sustained them, was the institutional creation their civilizational capability had produced, was the creative response to the environmental challenge that had made the Fremen what they were. The dissolution of the economy was the dissolution of the institution. The dissolution of the institution was the dissolution of the identity the institution had sustained. The dream consumed the dreamer's identity in the act of the dream's realization. The Fremen's ecological dream was the saga's most sustained examination of the relationship between aspiration and consequence. And examining the dream in its full dimensions illuminates the planetary argument the dream embodied. Pardot Kynes initiated the dream. The imperial planetologist's assessment of the Arrakis ecology concluded that the transformation was possible, that the desert could be greened, that the water could be introduced, that the environmental conditions could be modified toward the conditions the human habitation preferred. The assessment was scientifically sound. The assessment was also ecologically devastating. The transformation's success would destroy the sandworm ecology the spice production depended on. Kynes presented the dream to the Fremen. The Fremen received the dream with the enthusiasm that the dream's promise generated, the promise of a world where water was not the scarce resource the desert's conditions made it, the promise of conditions that would relieve the environmental pressure the desert imposed, the promise of a future that was different from the present the desert defined. The dream became the Fremen's civilizational purpose. The ecological transformation, the planting, the water collection, the progressive modification of the environmental conditions became the project that organized the Fremen's collective effort, that gave the Fremen's desert existence a purpose beyond survival, that connected the current generation's work to the future generation's benefit. The purpose's timescale was generational. The dream was not achievable in a single lifetime, was designed to produce results across centuries of sustained effort. It was a project whose completion the current generation would not live to see. The generational timescale was the dream's most demanding quality, the requirement that the current generation invest effort in a project whose benefits would be received by people who had not yet been born. The Fremen accepted the generational timescale. The acceptance was the demonstration of the civilizational capability the desert had produced, the capacity for sustained collective effort across timescales that exceeded individual lifetimes, the ability to commit the community's resources to a project whose returns were measured in centuries rather than in years. The acceptance was the desert's gift, the patience the desert had cultivated, the long perspective the desert's conditions had imposed, the capacity for sustained commitment the desert's demands had refined. The dream's progress was documented across the saga's timeline in the ecological changes the progress produced. The plantings in the desert's margins, the water catchment system's gradual accumulation, the atmospheric moisture's slow increase, the vegetation's progressive establishment in the conditions the ecological modification created. The progress was real, was the measurable improvement in the environmental conditions the dream specified. The progress was also threatening, was the measurable deterioration of the conditions the sandworm ecology required. The dream's collision with the spice economy was the collision that the saga's ecological argument was built around. The dream said, the desert should be green. The economy said, the desert must remain a desert. The dream served the Fremen's aspiration. The economy served the civilization's dependency. The aspiration and the dependency were irreconcilable, were organized around opposite environmental conditions, each requiring the other's absence. The God Emperor's management of the collision was the management that the saga documented as the most comprehensive response the collision could receive. Leto II calibrated the terraforming's pace to the Golden Path's requirements, permitted the transformation's progress at the rate the governance's purposes specified, maintained the sandworm ecology at the levels the spice production's continuation demanded, managed the collision through the comprehensive attention the God Emperor's transformed consciousness provided. The management's end, the God Emperor's death, released the collision from the management's control. The unmanaged collision proceeded according to its own dynamics. The terraforming continued, the ecology responded, the conditions changed in the directions the uncontrolled dynamics generated. The collision's resolution, whatever the resolution would eventually be, was the resolution the unmanaged dynamics would produce. The relationship between planetary governance and environmental management across the saga's houses demonstrated the argument that governance philosophies produced environmental consequences, and that the consequences were as consequential as the governance's political outcomes. The Harkonnen governance of Giedi Prime produced environmental degradation. The industrial economy's prioritization of output over sustainability generated the pollution, the environmental damage, the ecological deterioration that the industrial production's byproducts created. The degradation was the governance philosophy's environmental expression, the visible evidence that the governance treated the environment as a resource to be consumed rather than as a system to be maintained. The Harkonnen governance of Arrakis produced ecological ignorance. The spice operations' focus on extraction rather than on ecological understanding generated the intelligence failure that the governance's environmental management consisted of, the failure to understand the sandworm life cycle, the failure to recognize the terraforming's progress, the failure to assess the ecological dynamics that the governance was operating within. The ignorance was the governance philosophy's environmental consequence, the result of treating the planet as a production facility rather than as an ecological system. The Atreides governance, brief as it was on Arrakis, represented the alternative approach. Leto's interest in the planet's ecology, his engagement with the Fremen's ecological knowledge, his governance's orientation toward understanding the conditions the governance was operating within, these were the environmental expressions of the governance as service philosophy that the Atreides tradition embodied. The God Emperor's governance represented the comprehensive approach. Leto II's management of the ecology, alongside the politics, the calibration of the environmental conditions to the governance's purposes, the attention to the ecological dynamics as sustained and as thorough as the attention to the political dynamics, was the environmental expression of the governance's comprehensiveness. Each governance philosophy produced the environmental relationship the philosophy implied. Exploitation produced degradation. Ignorance produced vulnerability. Service produced understanding. Comprehensiveness produced management. The environmental relationships were the governance philosophy's consequences, were generated by the philosophies with the same reliability the philosophies generated the political consequences. The planets bore the consequences. Giedi Prime bore the industrial degradation. Arrakis bore the ecological ignorance and the comprehensive management. Caladan bore the service ethics, environmental stewardship. Each planet carried the marks of the governance the planet received, showed in the environmental conditions the governance produced, the philosophy the governance embodied. The planet's role in the breeding program was the dimension that connected the planetary analysis to the saga's genetic argument. Because the breeding program's management was conducted through the placement of trained women in the noble houses that governed the planets the program managed. The placements were planetary. Each placement placed a woman on a world, placed the Bene Gesserit operative in the environmental conditions the governed planet provided, placed the breeding program's genetic management in the cultural context the planet's governance produced. The placement was not simply a political arrangement, was not simply the positioning of an operative in a noble household. The placement was a planetary arrangement, was the positioning of a genetic management function in the environmental and cultural conditions a world provided. The conditions affected the program. The woman placed on Caladan was placed in the Atreides service ethic, was positioned in the governance tradition that treated persons as persons rather than as instruments. The woman placed on Giedi Prime was placed in the Harkonnen exploitation ethic, was positioned in the governance tradition that treated persons as instruments rather than as persons. The conditions affected the placement's dynamics, affected the woman's relationship with the household, affected the management of the reproductive function the placement was designed to serve, affected the development of the children the placement produced. Jessica's placement on Caladan was the breeding program's most consequential placement, and the placement's planetary dimension was the dimension that shaped the placement's outcome. Jessica was placed with Leto on Caladan, was placed in the Atreides household's warmth, in the governance tradition's integrity, in the environmental conditions that Caladan's abundance provided. The conditions produced the attachment produced the disobedience produced pull. The chain ran from the planet through the conditions, through the attachment, through the decision, through the consequence. If Jessica had been placed on a different world, on a world whose conditions were harsher, whose governance tradition was less warm, whose institutional culture did not produce the attachment the placement's professional requirements were designed to prevent, the disobedience might not have occurred. The The placement's planetary dimension was the dimension that made the disobedience possible. The conditions that produced the emotional context the attachment developed in, the environment that shaped the relationship the professional distance was supposed to maintain. Caladan made Jessica love Leto. The love made Jessica disobey. The disobedience made Paul. The planet's conditions were the conditions that produced the saga's initiating act. The breeding program's management did not account for the planetary dimension with the thoroughness the dimension's significance required. The program managed the genetics, managed the reproductive configurations the placements produced, managed the bloodlines the configurations combined. The program did not manage the planets, did not account for the environmental conditions' influence on the placement's emotional dynamics, did not anticipate the attachment the conditions might produce, did not include the planetary dimension in the program's risk assessment. The oversight was the program's most consequential institutional failure, the failure that the breeding program's genetic focus produced by excluding the environmental dimension from the program's management. The genetics were managed, the emotions were not. The emotions were the planet's product. The planet produced the attachment. The attachment produced the disobedience. The program failed because the program did not manage the world the program was operating on. The planet's final contribution to the saga was the contribution of perspective, the demonstration, sustained across the saga's full timeline, that the human drama was conducted on a stage whose conditions shaped the drama's character and whose changes transformed the drama's trajectory. The perspective was humbling. The human events, the revolutions, the governances, the conspiracies, the jihads, the scatterings, were events conducted on worlds whose conditions the events could modify but could not control. The desert waited for the governance to end. The ecology regenerated after the management's cessation. The planet persisted after the civilization's transformation. The world outlasted the world's inhabitants. The perspective was also inspiring. The planet's conditions produced the people whose capabilities exceeded what the conditions' demands alone would have suggested. The desert produced the Fremen. The Fremen exceeded the desert. The prison planet produced the Sardaukar. The Sardaukar exceeded the prison. The industrial world produced the governance. The governance exceeded the industry. The people's capabilities, the creative, adaptive, inventive responses the conditions generated, exceeded the conditions that generated them. The exceedance was the human contribution. The planets provided the conditions. The people provided the responses. The responses exceeded the conditions. The exceedance was the creativity, was the quality that distinguished the human response from the mechanical, that made the adaptation more than the simple adjustment to the conditions' demands, that produced the institutions and the cultures and the civilizations that the conditions alone could not have generated. The planets and the people were the partnership. The conditions and the responses were the interaction. The interaction was the saga. The most important planets in the Dune universe were important because they participated in the partnership, because they provided the conditions that generated the responses that produced the history the saga documented. The importance was relational, was the importance of the partner whose contribution made the other partner's contribution possible. The worlds made the people made the history. The history was the partnership's product, the most important planets in the Dune universe, the partners in the saga's story, the shield wall, the massive geological formation that separated the settled areas of Arrakis from the deep desert, was the planet's most consequential geographical feature, and the feature's significance extended beyond the military dimension the battle for Arrakeen dramatized. The shield wall was natural. The formation was not built, was not constructed by human engineering or maintained by human effort. The formation was geological, was the product of the planetary processes that had shaped the planet's surface across the deep time the geology's operations required. The formation was there before the humans arrived. The formation would be there after the humans departed. The wall divided the planet into two zones. The settled zone, the area the wall's protection provided with the reduced exposure to the deep desert sandstorms and the reduced presence of the sandworms the wall's geological barrier maintained, was the zone the Imperium's governance occupied. The administrative centers, the spice operations facilities, the population the governance recognized, all were located in the settled zone the wall protected. The deep desert, the zone beyond the wall's protection, exposed to the full force of the desert's environmental conditions, inhabited by the sandworms whose movements the geological barrier did not restrict, was the zone the Fremen inhabited. The Sietches, the deep desert communities, the civilization the administrative assessment did not see, all were located in the zone the wall's absence left unprotected and ungoverned. The division was the planet's contribution to the political dynamics the saga documented. The wall separated the visible from the invisible, the governed from the ungoverned, the assessed from the unassessed. The separation was the geographical expression of the intelligence failure the saga's political narrative documented, the physical mechanism through which the Fremen's invisibility to the administrative assessment was maintained. Paul breached the wall. The Fremen assault's most dramatic element, the use of atomics to blast a passage through the shield wall's geological barrier, was the breach of the division the wall had maintained. The breach was military, was the tactical action that provided the Fremen armies access to the settled zone the assault required. The breach was also symbolic, was the destruction of the barrier that had separated the visible from the invisible, the governed from the ungoverned, the assessed from the unassessed. The breach said, "The invisible is here, the ungoverned is here, the unassessed is here. The wall that separated the two zones is broken, and the people the wall concealed are coming through." The Sietches were the Fremen's architectural response to the desert's conditions, and the architecture illuminated the relationship between the environment and the civilization the environment produced. The Sietches were underground, not partially underground, not the semi-subterranean structures that some architectural traditions produced in response to extreme surface conditions. Fully underground, carved into the rock beneath the desert's surface, concealed from the observation the surface exposure would have permitted, protected from the environmental extremes the surface conditions imposed. The underground architecture was the desert's architecture, was the construction that the desert's conditions made necessary, the building form that the environmental demands generated. The surface was lethal, the subsurface was survivable, the architecture went where the survival was. The Sietch's internal organization reflected the communal ethic the water discipline sustained. The living spaces were communal, were organized around the shared areas the community's social life required rather than around the individual spaces the private life preferred. The water reserves were central, were located in the protected positions the reserve's importance demanded, were managed through the communal governance the water discipline provided. The food production areas, the manufacturing spaces, the training grounds, all were organized within the subsurface architecture the community's collective needs specified. The wind traps were the Sietch's most consequential engineering, the devices that captured the atmospheric moisture the desert air contained and channeled it into the community's water reserves. The wind traps were the Fremen's primary water collection technology. the mechanism through which the desert's minimal atmospheric moisture was converted into the liquid water the community's survival required. The wind traps demonstrated the Fremen's engineering capability in its ecological dimension, the ability to design and maintain technology that extracted a usable resource from the environmental conditions the desert provided. The engineering was not industrial, was not the large-scale, capital-intensive technology the Ixian or the Richezian traditions produced. The engineering was ecological, was the small-scale, environment-adapted technology the desert's conditions demanded, designed to work with the environment rather than against it. The sietches were invisible from the surface. The community's concealment, the maintenance of the underground location's secrecy from the governance's observation, was the architectural expression of the Fremen's broader concealment from the administrative assessment. The sietches were hidden the way the population was hidden, were maintained in the invisibility that the governance's attention did not penetrate, were kept from the observation that the governance's intelligence apparatus did not extend to. The concealment was total. The Harkonnen governance, 80 years of administration, decades of intelligence gathering, the sustained attention of one of the Imperium's most capable political operations, did not discover the sietch's locations or the sietch's contents. The governance did not know where the Fremen lived, did not know how many Fremen there were, did not know what the Fremen's communities contained. The architectural concealment and the demographic concealment were the same concealment, were the Fremen's sustained, comprehensive, civilizational refusal to be visible to the governance the Fremen did not accept. Arrakis as a geological entity, as a world whose physical processes operated independently of the human activity the surface supported, was the dimension of the planet that connected the saga's ecological argument to the deep time perspective the geological timescale provided. The planet's geological processes were ancient. The rock formations, the sand deposits, the atmospheric conditions that the planet's geology had produced across the deep time the geological operations required. These were the features the human activity was conducted on and within, the conditions the human presence had to accommodate, rather than the conditions the human activity could control. The sand was the geology's most visible product. The desert's sand, the granular material that covered the planet's surface, that the sandworms moved through, that the spice was deposited in, that the wind shaped into the dunes the desert's aesthetics were defined by, was the product of geological processes that had been operating for timescales that exceeded the human presence's duration. The geological perspective was the perspective of the planet as a physical system, rather than as a political territory. The political perspective said, Arrakis is a fief, a governed territory, an economic asset. The geological perspective said, Arrakis is a world, a physical system, a planet whose processes operate independently of the governance the political perspective imposes. The two perspectives were the saga's ecological argument in its planetary dimension. The political perspective organized the human activity on the planet, organized the governance, the economy, the military operations that the human presence generated. The geological perspective contained the human activity, provided the conditions within which the governance and the economy and the military operated, maintained the physical system whose conditions the human activity had to accommodate. The political perspective was temporary. The geological perspective was permanent. The governance that the political perspective organized lasted for decades or centuries. The conditions that the geological perspective described lasted for millennia or longer. The disproportion between the two perspectives' timescales was the saga's ecological argument about the relationship between human activity and planetary reality. The argument that the human activity was conducted within conditions the human activity could modify but could not control, that the planet's physical system would outlast the human activity's institutional expressions. The planet's collective testimony about civilization was the testimony that the saga's full planetary analysis produced, the argument about the nature of interstellar civilization that the examination of the civilization's worlds revealed. The testimony said, civilization is planetary. The civilization that the saga documented was not an abstract political arrangement, was not a governance operating in a vacuum, a politics conducted without a physical context. The civilization was rooted in worlds, was grounded in the conditions the worlds provided, was shaped by the environments the worlds maintained, was sustained by the resources the worlds generated. The roots were the civilization's strength. The worlds provided the conditions that produced the capabilities the civilization deployed, the warriors the desert forged, the governance the water world nurtured, the technology the engineering world developed, the biological capability the secret world cultivated. The capabilities were the world's products. The products were the civilization's tools. The roots were also the civilization's vulnerability. The dependency on the world's conditions, the reliance on the desert spice, the dependency on the prison planet's hardening, the need for the engineering world's technology, made the civilization vulnerable to the conditions' disruption. The disruption of a world was the disruption of the capability the world produced. The disruption of the capability was the disruption of the civilization the capability sustained. The testimony concluded that the interstellar civilization was a network of planetary dependencies, a system whose functioning was sustained by the conditions the system's worlds provided, and whose vulnerability was created by the conditions' concentration. The concentration was the vulnerability. The diversification was the remedy. The Golden Path's dispersal was the dispersal of the dependencies. The distribution of the civilization's conditions across enough worlds that no single world's disruption could disrupt the civilization's functioning. The planets were the civilization's foundation. The foundation's character determined the civilization's character. The foundation's vulnerability determined the civilization's vulnerability. The foundation's diversification was the civilization's survival. The most important planets in the Dune universe were the planets that demonstrated this, that showed, through their conditions and their contributions and their vulnerabilities, the relationship between the worlds and the civilization the world sustained. Every planet was important, every world contributed, every condition shaped, every environment produced. The civilization was the world's civilization. The worlds were the civilization's worlds. The relationship was reciprocal. The reciprocity was the story. The most important planets in the Dune universe. The worlds that made the civilization possible. The worlds that made the civilization vulnerable. The worlds that would, through their diversification, make the civilization survivable. Every one of them mattered. The planets were the story.